Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The autumn of 2023 brought with it a series of disturbing reports that would forever change how I viewed the wilderness that had become my sanctuary. I was 26 then, working a mundane office job in Utrecht that left me feeling trapped between fluorescent lights and computer screens for most of my waking hours. The only thing that kept me sane was my nightly escapes into the forests that dotted the Dutch-German border region. It started with whispered conversations in local pubs, hushed discussions between farmers who gathered around weathered wooden tables, their faces etched with concern and confusion. The first official report came from a sheep farmer named Cornelis van der Berg, whose property stretched along the eastern edge of Gelderland province. On a foggy Tuesday morning in early October, he discovered 7 of his prize-breeding ewes lying motionless in their pasture, their bodies arranged in an almost ceremonial pattern that made his stomach turn. The local veterinarian, Dr. Hendrika Vos, arrived within hours of the discovery. What she found defied her 30 years of experience treating livestock attacks. The sheep hadn't simply been killed. They had been systematically executed. Each animal bore identical wounds, a single, devastating bite to the throat that had severed the carotid artery with surgical precision. The bite radius measured exactly 7 centimeters across, far larger than any domestic dog could produce. Yet the depth and clean edges suggested an intelligence behind the attack that no wild animal should possess. In all my years, Dr. Voss told the local newspaper, I've never seen anything like this. Wolves kill to eat. But these animals were left completely untouched. No flesh was consumed, no organs removed. It's as if something killed for the pure sake of killing. The most disturbing detail emerged when crime scene investigators, yes, they had called in actual police forensics, examined the scene more thoroughly. Surrounding each dead sheep was a perfect circle of paw prints, each measuring nearly 18 centimeters in length. The prints showed deliberate placement, as if the killer had walked methodically around each victim before striking. The depth of the impression suggested an animal weighing at least 80 kilograms, yet the prints showed no signs of claws, which ruled out bears or large wild cats. Within 2 weeks, 3 more farms reported similar attacks. The pattern remained consistent. Multiple sheep killed but not eaten, precise throat wounds, and those unnaturally large paw prints arranged in perfect circles around each carcass. The local police established a task force, and wildlife experts from Wageningen University were brought in to analyze the evidence. Professor Adrian Klein, the university's leading expert on predator behavior, held a press conference that I watched from my cramped apartment, feeling an inexplicable chill as he spoke. The behavior we're observing is unprecedented in the scientific literature, he announced, his usually confident demeanor noticeably shaken. No known predator species exhibits this type of systematic killing without consumption. The precision of the wounds suggests an animal with extraordinary bite force and jaw control, yet the complete absence of feeding behavior contradicts every predatory instinct we understand. The media dubbed it the ghost wolf of Gelderland, though Professor Klein repeatedly insisted that wolves had been extinct in the Netherlands for over a century and a half. DNA samples from the bite wounds proved inconclusive. The saliva contained genetic markers consistent with Canis lupus, yet several sequences didn't match any known wolf subspecies in existing databases. As autumn deepened into winter, the attacks suddenly stopped. No more dead sheep, no more mysterious paw prints, no more terrified farmers calling the police in the pre-dawn hours. The task force was quietly disbanded, the university experts returned to their laboratories, and the local news moved on to other stories. But the farmers didn't forget. They installed motion-activated cameras, reinforced their fencing, and many began keeping loaded rifles by their doors. I followed every news report with an obsession that disturbed even me. Something about the systematic nature of the killings, the intelligence implied by the evidence, resonated with a dark fascination I didn't fully understand. I printed out newspaper articles and pinned them to the wall of my apartment, creating a timeline of events that grew more complex with each passing day. My colleagues at work began commenting on my distracted behavior, my inability to focus on spreadsheets and quarterly reports, when my mind was consumed by thoughts of what might be lurking in the forests I loved so deeply. The official explanation, when it finally came, was disappointingly mundane. A rogue pack of hybrid wolf dogs, the authorities declared, probably abandoned pets that had reverted to wild behavior. The precision of the kills was explained away as learned behavior from their domestic upbringing, and the lack of consumption was attributed to stress and territorial marking. Case closed, files archived, public concerns officially addressed. But I knew better. I had spent too many nights in those forests, felt too deeply connected to their rhythms and secrets, to accept such a sanitized explanation. There was something else out there, something that the authorities either couldn't identify or chose not to acknowledge. And as winter gave way to the promising warmth of early spring 2024, I found myself drawn more and more frequently to the very regions where the attacks had occurred. My supervisor, a perpetually stressed woman named Ingrid, who smelled of stale coffee and unfulfilled dreams, called me into her office on a particularly dreary March afternoon. "Your performance has been declining," she said, not bothering to look up from the evaluation form she was filling out. "Your attention seems to be elsewhere lately. Is everything all right at home?" I wanted to tell her about the nights I spent hiking through forests where something had killed sheep with surgical precision. I wanted to explain how the official explanations felt like lies designed to comfort a public that couldn't handle the truth. Instead, I mumbled something about stress and promised to do better. But even as I spoke, I was already planning my next nocturnal expedition, already feeling the familiar pull of the wild places that had become more real to me than the fluorescent-lit office where I wasted my days. That evening, I spread out detailed topographical maps of the Gelderland region on my kitchen table, marking each location where attacks had been reported. A pattern emerged that the official investigation had apparently missed, or chosen to ignore. The kills formed a rough circle approximately 15 kilometers in diameter, centered on a dense section of forest that local hikers rarely visited due to its swampy terrain and poor trail maintenance. I traced the circle with my finger, feeling a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. Whatever had killed those sheep was still out there, still following patterns that only I seemed to recognize. And tomorrow night, I would begin my search for the truth that everyone else was too frightened or too comfortable to pursue. My relationship with the forests began long before the sheep killings, rooted in a childhood trauma that I've never discussed with anyone, not even the therapist my parents forced me to see after the incident. I was 11 years old when my younger brother, Peter, disappeared during a family camping trip in the Hogevelua National Park. We were playing hide-and-seek among the towering pine trees while our parents set up camp, and he simply vanished. The search lasted 4 days, involving hundreds of volunteers, police dogs, and helicopter surveillance. They found his body at the bottom of a ravine, apparently the victim of an accidental fall. But I knew better. I had heard him screaming in the distance, a sound that cut through the forest like a blade through silk, filled with terror beyond anything a simple fall could produce. When I tried to tell the adults about the screams, they dismissed them as my imagination, traumatic stress manifesting as false memories. The official cause of death was accidental drowning. He had fallen into a stream and struck his head on the rocks. From that day forward, the woods called to me with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. I couldn't stay away from them, couldn't resist the pull of the deep forest where shadows moved in ways that defied explanation and sounds carried meanings that civilized people had forgotten how to interpret. My parents worried, of course. They took me to specialists who diagnosed me with everything from PTSD to obsessive-compulsive disorder, but none of their treatments could diminish the magnetic force that drew me into the wilderness. By the time I reached university age, my nocturnal wanderings had become a central part of my identity. I studied forestry management, partly to understand the ecosystems I was so drawn to, but mostly to have legitimate reasons for spending time in remote locations where others feared to tread. My professors noted my unusual ability to navigate in complete darkness, my uncanny skill at identifying animal tracks and behavioral patterns, and my disturbing comfort level in situations that sent other students fleeing back to their dormitories. Dr. Margaretha Zylstra, my wildlife behavior instructor, pulled me aside after a particularly intense field exercise in the Kinderdijk wetlands. "You have an extraordinary connection to the natural world," she said, studying my face with the analytical intensity of someone accustomed to observing predator-prey relationships. "But there's something almost feral about the way you move in the forest. Are you getting enough sleep? Maintaining proper social connections?" I assured her that I was fine, but the truth was more complicated. My nocturnal expeditions had grown longer and more frequent, often lasting entire nights as I explored territories that even experienced rangers avoided. I had developed an ability to move through dense undergrowth without making a sound, to read the subtle signs that indicated predator presence, and to distinguish between the normal sounds of nighttime forest activity and the unnatural silences that preceded danger. The sheep killings changed everything. Suddenly, my obsession had a focus, a specific mystery that demanded investigation. I began carrying detailed journals on my night hikes, documenting every unusual sound, every displaced branch, every scent that didn't belong to the normal ecosystem. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic as I recorded observations that I knew no one else would believe. The way certain areas of forest fell completely silent at specific times of night, the strange patterns of broken branches that formed geometric shapes too precise to be natural, the occasional discovery of animal bones arranged in configurations that suggested intelligence and purpose. My apartment became a shrine to the mystery. Topographical maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins indicating reported sightings, unusual animal behavior, and my own disturbing discoveries. I installed a police scanner to monitor emergency calls from the rural districts, and I kept detailed files on every farmer, ranger, and local resident who had reported unusual incidents. My neighbors began to complain about the smell. I had stopped bathing regularly, finding that human soap and deodorant interfered with my ability to detect the subtle scents that provided crucial information during my forest investigations. Work became increasingly difficult to endure. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes, which had adapted to function optimally in near-total darkness. The constant chatter of my colleagues felt like meaningless noise compared to the rich symphony of forest sounds that had become my preferred language. I found myself snapping at people who interrupted my concentration, becoming aggressive when forced to participate in team meetings or social events that kept me away from my true calling. Ingrid's concerns about my performance were completely justified, though for reasons she couldn't possibly understand. I was no longer fully human in the conventional sense. My senses had sharpened to superhuman levels. My reflexes had adapted to the split-second timing required for survival in predator territory, and my understanding of natural systems had evolved beyond what any textbook could teach. I could identify individual animals by their scent trails, predict weather changes by the behavior of insects, and navigate complex terrain using only the subtle variations in air current and sound reflection that indicated the presence of trees, rocks, and water sources. The transformation wasn't entirely pleasant. Human food began to taste bland and artificial compared to the wild berries and edible plants I had learned to identify during my expeditions. Sleeping indoors felt suffocating. I often found myself opening all the windows in my apartment and lying on the floor, trying to recreate the sensation of sleeping under an open sky. My social relationships deteriorated as I lost interest in conversations that didn't relate to tracking, animal behavior, or forest ecosystems. Dr. Hendrik van Essen, a psychologist my concerned sister convinced me to visit, attempted to diagnose my condition as a form of dissociative disorder. "You're using the forest as an escape from trauma," he explained during our single session together. The nocturnal wandering, the hypervigilance, the social isolation. These are all symptoms of someone trying to avoid processing a deeply painful experience. I wanted to explain that I wasn't escaping into the forest. I was returning to it. The woods weren't a refuge from reality. They were reality, raw and honest and unfiltered by the comfortable lies that civilized society told itself. In the forest, death was immediate and honest. Predators didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were, and prey animals didn't delude themselves about their place in the food chain. It was the only environment where I felt truly alive, truly myself. As spring progressed into summer, my expeditions grew more ambitious. I began exploring territories that had been off-limits even to experienced hikers, penetrating deep into swamplands and dense forest areas where the canopy was so thick that daylight never reached the ground. I discovered animal trails that didn't correspond to any known species migration patterns, finding tracks that measured larger than any animal that should exist in the Dutch ecosystem. The most disturbing discovery came on a humid July night when I was exploring a particularly remote section of forest near the German border. Hidden beneath a natural overhang created by fallen trees, I found what could only be described as a lair. The ground had been deliberately cleared and shaped into a circular depression approximately 3 meters in diameter. The earth was packed hard and smooth, stained dark with what might have been blood. Arranged around the perimeter were dozens of bones. Sheep bones, I realized with growing horror, picked completely clean and organized by size and type with a precision that suggested planning and intelligence. But it was the smell that truly terrified me. The entire area reeked of something that wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite dog, but contained elements of both along with other scents I couldn't identify. It was the smell of something that didn't belong in any ecosystem I understood, something that existed outside the normal rules of predator and prey. I documented everything with my camera, took detailed measurements, and collected samples of the strange dark soil for later analysis. That night marked a turning point in my obsession. I was no longer simply investigating unusual animal behavior. I was tracking something that challenged every assumption I had about the natural world. And based on the freshness of the scent markers around the lair, something that was very much still active in the region. I made a decision that would have horrified anyone who cared about my well-being. I would begin spending entire nights in the forest, waiting and watching for whatever had created that unnatural sanctuary. My vacation time from work would be dedicated to a systematic surveillance operation that would either provide answers or confirm my growing suspicion that I was dealing with something beyond normal scientific classification. The hunt was about to begin. September 15th, 2024. The date is burned into my memory with the same intensity as a brand on cattle hide. I had been planning this particular expedition for 3 weeks, studying weather patterns, moon phases, and local animal activity reports to optimize my chances of making contact with whatever had killed those sheep. The forecast promised a moonless night with intermittent cloud cover, perfect conditions for something that preferred to hunt in complete darkness. I left my apartment at 6:30 p.m., loading my mountain bike with equipment that would have seemed excessive to any casual observer. Night vision binoculars, motion detecting cameras, audio recording equipment, and enough food and water to sustain a 3-day surveillance operation. My backpack also contained items that I hoped I wouldn't need. A military-grade flashlight capable of producing 3,000 lumens, a high-pitched whistle designed to disorient aggressive animals, and a folding knife with a 12-centimeter blade that I had practiced drawing in complete darkness until the motion became automatic. The ride to the forest took 45 minutes, following back roads that wound through agricultural districts where farmers had learned to bring their livestock indoors well before sunset. I passed 3 properties where motion-activated floodlights had been installed around sheep pens, their harsh illumination creating pools of artificial daylight in the gathering dusk. Security cameras were mounted on fence posts, their red recording lights blinking like electronic eyes that watched for threats the owners couldn't name. I chained my bike to a utility pole approximately half a kilometer from the forest entrance, in a location that would allow for rapid escape if circumstances required it. The walk to my chosen observation point would take me through increasingly dense vegetation, following animal trails that I had memorized during previous reconnaissance missions. My destination was a natural blind created by fallen trees and dense undergrowth, positioned approximately 200 meters from the area where I had discovered the bone circle 3 months earlier. As I entered the forest, the familiar sensation of heightened awareness flooded my nervous system. My vision adjusted automatically to the minimal light conditions, revealing details that would have been invisible to normal human perception. The texture of bark became tactile information that I could process without touching. The subtle variations in ground consistency told me where to place my feet to avoid making noise, and the complex symphony of insect and small animal activity provided a real-time map of the ecosystem around me. But something was wrong. The normal patterns of forest sound were disrupted in ways that immediately triggered my alarm systems. Sections of woodland that should have been active with nocturnal creatures were completely silent, creating dead zones of unnatural quiet that moved through the landscape like an infection spreading through healthy tissue. I paused frequently to analyze these disturbances, trying to determine whether they indicated the presence of a predator or something more unusual. 20 minutes into my approach, I encountered the first physical evidence that I was not alone in the forest. A sheep carcass, less than 6 hours old based on the temperature of the body and the progression of rigor mortis, lay beside a game trail that I had used countless times during previous expeditions. The kill was identical to those reported in the media: a single devastating bite to the throat, no consumption of flesh, and the distinctive circular arrangement of enormous paw prints around the body. But this kill was different in one crucial detail. The sheep hadn't been part of any local flock. Its ear tags identified it as belonging to a farm more than 20 kilometers away. Something had transported this animal across a significant distance before killing it in this specific location. The implications were staggering. Either I was dealing with a predator intelligent enough to engage in complex hunting strategies, or the creature possessed physical capabilities that defied biological norms. I photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting the precise placement of the carcass, the pattern of surrounding tracks, and the unusual absence of blood despite the massive throat wound. My hands remained steady as I worked, but my pulse was racing with a combination of terror and exhilaration that I had never experienced before. This was proof that my months of investigation had been justified, evidence that something extraordinary was active in these forests. The scent hit me as I was packing away my camera. Rich, musky, and completely unlike anything in my extensive catalog of forest smells. It contained elements of wet fur and fresh blood, but underneath these familiar components was something else. Something that triggered a primal fear response that bypassed rational thought and sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My body prepared for fight or flight before my conscious mind had even processed the threat. I crouched behind the fallen log that concealed my position, controlling my breathing and listening with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. The normal sounds of the forest had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so complete that it seemed to press against my eardrums like physical weight. Even the insects had stopped their chirping, creating an acoustic vacuum that made my own heartbeat sound like thunder. The footsteps, when they came, were deliberate and measured. Not the random wandering of a lost animal, but the purposeful movement of something that knew exactly where it was going. The spacing between steps suggested an animal much larger than any wolf, yet the sound was wrong for a bear or other large mammal. Each footfall was placed with careful precision, as if the creature was consciously minimizing noise while maintaining forward momentum. I raised my binoculars and scanned the area ahead of me, adjusting the focus to penetrate the deeper shadows between the trees. For several minutes, I saw nothing but the normal landscape of trunks, undergrowth, and fallen branches that created the complex three-dimensional maze of the forest floor. Then, moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a shape detached itself from the darkness and began moving directly toward my position. My first thought was that I was observing an unusually large wolf, perhaps a specimen that had wandered south from the expanding populations in Germany or Poland. But as the creature moved closer, details became visible that challenged this initial identification. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too broad through the chest, with limbs that were longer relative to body size than any wolf I had ever studied. The head was massive, with ears that seemed almost human in their shape and placement. But it was the eyes that shattered any attempt to categorize this animal within normal taxonomic classifications. They reflected the minimal available light with an intensity that suggested a tapetum lucidum far more developed than that of any terrestrial predator. More disturbing was their apparent focus and intelligence. This wasn't the random environmental scanning of an animal following scent trails. These were the calculated observations of something that was actively hunting. The creature paused approximately 50 meters from my hiding place, raising its head to sample the air with the same methodical approach it applied to its movement. I realized with growing horror that it was tracking my scent, following the chemical trail I had left during my approach to this location. My elaborate concealment was meaningless if the animal could pinpoint my exact position through olfactory analysis. I gripped the handle of my knife, knowing that the weapon would be useless against an animal of this size, but finding comfort in the familiar weight of the blade. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I had to make a conscious effort to prevent my hands from trembling as I continued to observe the creature through my binoculars. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon my equipment and flee back to the safety of civilization, but I forced myself to remain motionless. The creature's head turned in my direction with mechanical precision, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, we stared directly at each other across the darkness. I saw intelligence in those reflective eyes, awareness and calculation that transcended normal animal cognition. This wasn't a wild beast operating on instinct. This was something that understood its environment and its own capabilities with a sophistication that terrified me. Then, without warning, it stood upright. The transformation was fluid and natural, as if the creature possessed a skeletal and muscular system designed for both quadrupedal and bipedal locomotion. Standing erect, it towered at least 2.5 meters tall, its silhouette resembling a grotesque fusion of human and canine anatomy. The arms were longer than they should have been, ending in hands that were clearly capable of manipulating objects with the same dexterity as human fingers. I stopped breathing entirely, afraid that even the sound of my respiration might trigger an attack. The creature stood motionless for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 hours. Time had become meaningless in the face of this encounter. Then, moving with the same deliberate precision it had displayed while walking, it turned and began moving away from my position. But not before pausing to look back at me one final time, its head tilted at an angle that was unmistakably human in its curiosity and assessment. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about the stupidity of pursuing a predator that could stand 7 feet tall and had just demonstrated capabilities beyond any known animal species. But rationality had ceased to be a determining factor in my behavior months ago. I waited exactly 10 minutes after the creature disappeared before emerging from my hiding place, using the time to document my observations and formulate a tracking strategy that might allow me to maintain contact without triggering a lethal confrontation. The creature's trail was unlike anything I had encountered during my years of studying wildlife behavior. The paw prints, I still thought of them as paw prints, though they were clearly something more complex, were spaced nearly 2 meters apart when the animal moved at a normal pace. The depth of the impression suggested a weight distribution that was all wrong for a quadruped. Too much pressure on the rear feet, not enough on the front. It was the track pattern of something that was equally comfortable moving on 4 legs or 2. More disturbing were the occasional handprints I found pressed into soft patches of earth. 5 distinct fingers, each ending in what appeared to be a retractable claw, with an opposable thumb that could manipulate objects with human-level dexterity. The size was enormous. Each handprint measured nearly 20 centimeters from wrist to fingertip, but the proportions were unmistakably humanoid. I followed the trail for approximately 1 kilometer, moving with exaggerated caution and pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate the creature's presence ahead of me. The track led deeper into the forest, toward areas where the canopy was so dense that even my adapted vision struggled to penetrate the absolute darkness. My flashlight remained unused. Any artificial light would announce my presence to something that clearly possessed superior sensory capabilities. The trail began to reveal behavioral patterns that challenged every assumption I had made about predator psychology. Rather than following the most direct route through the terrain, the creature had chosen a path that kept it concealed from potential aerial observation, while simultaneously providing multiple escape routes at every turning point. This wasn't the random wandering of an animal following instinct. This was tactical movement that demonstrated planning and environmental awareness. At several points along the trail, I discovered evidence of deliberate scent marking. The creature had stopped to urinate against specific trees, but not randomly. Each marking was positioned at exactly the same height, approximately 1.5 meters above ground level, and spaced at regular intervals that suggested territorial boundary establishment. The scent was unlike anything in my experience: powerful, musky, with chemical components that seemed to trigger unconscious fear responses in every mammal I had observed reacting to it. Small animals had fled the area entirely. No rabbit tracks, no evidence of nocturnal rodent activity, no droppings from the deer that normally use these trails for their evening feeding migrations. It was as if the creature's passage had created a biological dead zone that extended for hundreds of meters on either side of its route. Even the insects had gone silent, their normal chorus replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my footsteps sound like gunshots despite my careful movement. After 45 minutes of tracking, I discovered the first indication of where the creature might be heading. A game trail that I had used during previous expeditions intersected the creature's route, and fresh tracks showed that it had paused at this junction for several minutes before continuing in a direction that led toward the densest section of the forest. But these weren't the only tracks at the intersection. Human footprints, approximately size 11 hiking boots, overlapped with the creature's trail. Someone else had been here within the last few hours, following the same route I was now pursuing. The boot prints showed signs of hurried movement, longer strides, deeper heel impressions that indicated running or at least rapid walking. Whoever had made these tracks had been either pursuing the creature or fleeing from it. I knelt beside the clearest boot print, using my finger to measure the depth and studying the tread pattern with growing unease. The print was fresh enough that moisture was still seeping into the impression from the surrounding soil. Less than 2 hours old, possibly much more recent. The person who had made this track might still be in the forest, might even be close enough to hear me if I called out. But calling out would also announce my presence to whatever they had been tracking. The decision to continue following both trails required every ounce of courage I possessed. I was no longer simply observing an unusual predator. I was entering a situation that involved unknown human actors and potentially life-threatening variables that I couldn't assess or control. My knife felt inadequate. My escape route was becoming more complex with every step deeper into the forest, and my communication equipment was useless in terrain that blocked most radio signals. The combined trail led me through increasingly difficult terrain. Dense undergrowth that required crawling to penetrate, swampy areas where the ground was unstable, and every step risked creating noise that would carry for hundreds of meters, and rocky outcroppings that forced me to choose between speed and stealth. My clothing was soaked with perspiration despite the cool night air, and my hands were beginning to shake from the sustained adrenaline response that had been flooding my system for over an hour. Then I smelled smoke. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the forest from somewhere ahead of my position. Someone had built a fire, either deliberately or as the result of an accident that had ignited the tinder-dry undergrowth that covered much of this area. Fire in dense forest was potentially more dangerous than any predator, capable of spreading with explosive speed and trapping anyone caught in its path. But the smoke carried other scents as well. Burning meat, possibly lamb or mutton, with the distinctive aroma of fat rendering in open flame. Someone was cooking food, which suggested a level of confidence and preparation that didn't match the hurried movement indicated by the boot prints. Either the person I was tracking had stopped to eat, or I was approaching a campsite that existed independently of tonight's activities. The possibility that I might encounter other people in this remote location filled me with almost as much dread as the prospect of facing the creature I had been following. Humans who chose to spend time in areas where large predators were active were often individuals whose motivations couldn't be trusted. Poachers, illegal hunters, or worse. People who came to the deep forest to engage in activities that required absolute privacy and no witnesses. I approached the source of the smoke with extreme caution, moving from tree to tree and pausing for several minutes between each advance to listen for voices or other sounds that might indicate human presence. The scent grew stronger as I moved forward, but it was accompanied by something else that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The smell of fresh blood, much stronger than what would be produced by normal cooking activities. Not the small amount of blood that escaped from properly butchered meat, but the massive quantities that resulted from a recent kill. Something had died very recently, and very violently, in the area immediately ahead of my position. I found them in a clearing that had been created by fallen trees, probably the result of a storm that had passed through the region several years earlier. The scene that greeted me challenged my ability to process what I was seeing and reconcile it with any normal explanation. A small campfire burned in the center of the clearing, surrounded by carefully arranged stones that indicated experienced outdoor skills. Suspended over the fire on a makeshift spit was what appeared to be a leg of lamb, expertly butchered and prepared for cooking. The meat was fresh enough that blood was still dripping into the flames, creating small flares and the hissing sound that had helped me locate the campsite. But the lamb hadn't been purchased from any butcher shop. 3 sheep carcasses lay arranged around the perimeter of the clearing, each displaying the identical throat wounds that had become the signature of the creature I was tracking. The bodies were positioned with geometric precision, forming a perfect triangle with the campfire at its center. Most of the meat had been removed from the bones with surgical skill, processed into portions that hung from nearby tree branches like a macabre delicatessen. And standing beside the fire, turning the roasting meat with movements that were both human and disturbingly wrong, was the creature I had been following. But it was no longer moving on 4 legs. In the flickering light of the campfire, the true nature of what I was observing became undeniably clear. This wasn't simply an unusually large wolf that could occasionally rear up on its hind legs. This was something that existed in a perpetual state between human and animal, possessing the capabilities of both while belonging fully to neither category. The creature stood approximately 7 feet tall, its body covered in dense fur that ranged from dark brown along the back to lighter tan on the chest and stomach. But the proportions were wrong for any natural animal. The legs were too long, the arms too developed, and the hands, God help me, they were clearly hands, manipulated the makeshift cooking implements with the same dexterity that any experienced outdoorsman might display. Its head was the most disturbing aspect of its anatomy. The skull was elongated like a wolf's, with a pronounced muzzle filled with teeth that reflected the firelight when it opened its mouth to test the temperature of the cooking meat. But the eyes were positioned more forward than any predator's should be, providing the binocular vision necessary for complex tool use and fine manipulation. When it turned its head in my direction, as if sensing my presence despite my concealment, those eyes showed an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. I remained frozen behind the fallen log that concealed my position, afraid to move or even breathe normally for fear of attracting its attention. My camera was in my backpack, but reaching for it would require movements that might be detected by something with predator-level senses. Instead, I forced myself to memorize every detail of what I was witnessing, knowing that no one would believe my account without photographic evidence, but understanding that attempting to document the scene might result in my death. The creature finished adjusting the meat on its improvised spit and moved with fluid grace to examine the sheep carcasses arranged around the clearing. It paused beside each body, running its hands along the flanks and checking the quality of the remaining meat with the expertise of someone who had been processing animal carcasses for years. This wasn't random scavenging behavior. This was systematic food preparation that demonstrated planning and forethought. But the most terrifying realization came when I observed how it moved through the campsite. Every action was deliberate and purposeful, from banking the fire to maintain an optimal cooking temperature to checking the wind direction to ensure that smoke wouldn't accumulate in the clearing. This creature understood fire management, food safety, and campsite organization with a sophistication that required years of experience and learning. It was then that I noticed the human clothing. Arranged neatly beside the fire were hiking boots, cargo pants, and a flannel shirt that would have fit a very large man. The clothes were clean and well-maintained, suggesting regular use rather than items scavenged from a victim. More disturbing was the presence of human tools: a military surplus knife with a blade that could easily process large game, a small hatchet for cutting firewood, and what appeared to be a water purification system for ensuring safe drinking water during extended wilderness stays. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a wild animal that had learned to use human tools. This was something that lived as both human and predator, switching between forms as circumstances required. The systematic killing of sheep wasn't random predation. It was hunting behavior carried out by something that understood human agricultural systems and could plan complex operations that spanned multiple locations. I watched in horrified fascination as the creature completed its meal preparation and settled beside the fire in a sitting position that was eerily human. It used a sharpened stick to test the doneness of the roasting meat, rotating the spit when one side had cooked sufficiently, and even added what appeared to be wild herbs to enhance the flavor. The entire process was conducted with the casual competence of someone who had performed these same actions countless times before. But it was when the creature began to eat that I truly understood the scope of what I was witnessing. It consumed the cooked meat with obvious relish, tearing off portions with its hands and chewing with the appreciation of someone who understood culinary quality. But periodically, it would pause in its meal to gnaw directly on the raw bones of the sheep carcasses, crushing them with jaw strength that could easily crack human skulls. The transition between civilized eating and savage consumption was seamless, as if both behaviors were equally natural aspects of its feeding routine. 20 minutes into its meal, the creature suddenly stopped eating and raised its head to scan the surrounding forest. Its nostrils flared as it sampled the air, and its ears rotated independently to focus on specific sectors of the woodland around the clearing. Something had changed in the environment, some subtle shift in scent or sound that had triggered its alarm systems. I pressed myself closer to the ground, trying to become invisible while maintaining visual contact with the clearing. My heart was beating so hard that I was afraid the sound might be audible to something with supernatural hearing abilities. Every muscle in my body was tense with the anticipation of flight, though I knew that running would be useless against something that could apparently move with equal speed on 2 legs or 4. The creature stood slowly, its movements fluid and controlled despite its obvious state of alertness. It moved to the edge of the clearing and began a systematic examination of the tree line, pausing every few meters to analyze scents and sounds that were beyond my ability to detect. Its head turned in my direction, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, those intelligent eyes seemed to stare directly into mine. Then it began walking toward my hiding place. I had perhaps 30 seconds before it would reach the fallen log that concealed my position. My options were limited and all of them terrifying: remain hidden and hope that it would pass by without detecting me, attempt to flee through forest terrain where I would be at a severe disadvantage, or reveal myself and try to communicate with something that might be intelligent enough to understand human speech but predatory enough to kill me without hesitation. The creature was now close enough that I could hear its breathing, a sound that was deeper and more controlled than any animal's should be. It moved with the careful precision of something that was accustomed to stalking prey, placing each foot to minimize noise while maintaining the ability to spring into attack mode at any moment. The firelight behind it created a silhouette that was the stuff of nightmares, a fusion of human intelligence and predatory capability that violated every natural law I understood. 15 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds. I made a decision that was either the bravest or most foolish of my life. I stood up. The creature stopped immediately, its body language shifting from predatory stalking to surprised assessment. We stared at each other across a distance of less than 3 meters. Two species that should never have encountered each other in this way, each trying to determine whether the other represented an immediate threat. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you or interfere with what you're doing. I just want to understand." The creature tilted its head at an angle that was unmistakably human in its curiosity. Its eyes never left mine, but I could see intelligence working behind them, processing information and formulating responses in ways that transcended normal animal cognition. When it finally spoke, its voice was rough and distorted by vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech, but the words were clear and deliberately chosen. "You have been watching me for months." The sound of human speech from that inhuman throat triggered a primal terror response that bypassed all rational thought. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and something that should not exist, but was standing 3 meters away, speaking in a voice that somehow conveyed both intelligence and barely contained predatory instinct. But I forced myself to remain still, to meet those golden eyes that reflected the firelight like a wild animal's while carrying an awareness that was disturbingly human. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, came out as a hoarse whisper. "You can talk." The creature's mouth opened in what might have been amusement, revealing teeth that could tear through bone and sinew with effortless efficiency. "I have always been able to talk. The question is why you have been following me with such persistence." Its speech was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with precision as if speaking required conscious effort and concentration. The accent was unmistakably Dutch, with regional inflections that suggested someone who had grown up in the same general area where I lived and worked. This wasn't some exotic predator that had wandered in from distant wilderness. This was something that belonged to the local ecosystem and understood the human communities that surrounded it. "I wanted to understand what was killing the sheep," I said, surprised by my own honesty. The official explanations didn't make sense. The creature moved closer, and I had to fight every instinct to avoid backing away. Its movement was fluid and controlled, but I could see the potential for explosive violence in every line of its muscular frame. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of what might have been approval. "The officials prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. You are different. You seek truth even when it frightens you." I gestured toward the sheep carcasses arranged around the clearing. "Why do you kill them like that? Why not just take what you need?" The creature followed my gaze to the systematically butchered animals, then looked back at me with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "I take exactly what I need. No more, no less. The arrangement is aesthetic preference." The casualness with which it discussed its killing methodology sent ice through my veins. This wasn't a wild animal acting on instinct. This was something that made conscious choices about how to conduct its predatory activities. The geometric arrangement of the bodies, the precise throat wounds, the careful selection of victims, all of it was the result of deliberate decision-making by something that understood both efficiency and symbolic meaning. "What are you?" I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted to hear the answer. The creature was silent for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel like a laboratory specimen. When it finally responded, Its voice carried undertones of something that might have been sadness. I am what happens when the line between human and animal becomes meaningless, when the needs of both must be satisfied in the same body. It gestured toward the human clothing beside the fire. During the day, I work in an office in Utrecht. I attend meetings, complete spreadsheets, participate in the routines that define civilized existence. But when darkness comes, when the moon calls and the forest offers its gifts, I become what I was always meant to be. The revelation struck me with the force of physical blow. This wasn't some mythical creature or genetic anomaly. This was someone who lived a double existence, switching between human civilization and predatory wilderness as casually as changing clothes. The systematic nature of the sheep killings suddenly made perfect sense. Someone with human intelligence planning hunting operations, using predatory capabilities that exceeded anything in the natural world. "How many of you are there?" I managed to ask. The creature's expression shifted to something that looked like amusement. "You assume I am part of a group. What makes you think I am not unique?" Before I could formulate a response, the creature's head snapped toward the forest behind me, its nostrils flaring as it detected something that was beyond my sensory capabilities. Its body language shifted instantly from conversational to predatory, every muscle tensing for immediate action. "Someone else is coming," it said, its voice dropping to a growl that contained more animal than human elements. "Someone who means harm to both of us." I turned to look in the direction that had captured its attention, but my inferior senses detected nothing unusual. The forest appeared empty and silent, with no indication of approaching danger. But the creature's reaction was unmistakable. Whatever was approaching represented a threat significant enough to override its apparent willingness to continue our conversation. "You need to leave," the creature said, moving with liquid grace toward the human clothing beside the fire. "Now, before they realize you have seen me." "Who's coming?" I asked, but the creature was already beginning a transformation that defied biological possibility. Its posture shifted from upright to quadrupedal in seconds, its body seeming to compress and reshape itself for maximum speed and agility. The hands that had been manipulating cooking tools became paws capable of gripping terrain and propelling its body through dense undergrowth at incredible velocity. Most disturbing of all, its face elongated and became more wolf-like, though the intelligence in its eyes remained completely intact. "Government hunters," it said, its voice becoming increasingly distorted as its vocal cords adapted to a different configuration. "They have been tracking me for weeks. If they find you here, you will be eliminated as a witness." The casual way it discussed my potential murder focused my attention with terrifying clarity. This was no longer an encounter with an unusual predator. This was a situation involving human authorities who were willing to kill civilians to protect whatever secrets were associated with the creature's existence. "Run!" the creature commanded, its transformation now complete. "Follow the game trail northeast for 2 kilometers, then circle back to your bicycle using the main hiking path. Do not deviate from this route." I wanted to ask a dozen questions to understand who these government hunters were and why they considered the creature important enough to justify murdering witnesses. But the sound of approaching vehicles, still distant but growing closer, provided all the motivation I needed to abandon my investigation and focus on survival. I turned and ran into the forest, following the creature's directions while my mind struggled to process everything I had witnessed. Behind me, I could hear the systematic destruction of the campsite as the creature eliminated evidence of its human-like activities. The fire was extinguished, the cooking equipment hidden or destroyed, and the sheep carcasses dragged into positions that would suggest normal predatory behavior, rather than the calculated butchering I had observed. The game trail was barely visible in the darkness, but my months of nocturnal exploration had trained me to navigate by subtle visual cues that most people would miss entirely. I moved as quickly as stealth would allow, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit while trying to maintain the northeast bearing that would eventually lead me back to familiar territory. After 20 minutes of careful movement, I heard the first gunshots. 3 rapid reports from high-powered rifles, followed by shouting voices that carried through the forest despite the acoustic dampening effect of dense foliage. The voices were speaking Dutch, but with the clipped professional tone of military or law enforcement personnel conducting a coordinated operation. More gunshots, spaced at irregular intervals as if the shooters were tracking a moving target through difficult terrain. I forced myself to continue following the creature's prescribed route despite every instinct screaming at me to either flee in the opposite direction or return to help something that had shown me unexpected mercy. 20 minutes later, the forest fell silent. I reached my bicycle without encountering any of the government hunters, though I discovered fresh tire tracks from military-style vehicles that had been driven to within a few hundred meters of the forest edge. The operation had been planned and executed with professional efficiency, suggesting resources and authority that went far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. During the ride home, I struggled with the implications of everything I had witnessed. The creature's casual admission that it worked in an office in Utrecht meant that it was integrated into normal human society in ways that made detection almost impossible. Its knowledge of government pursuit suggested that whatever agency was hunting it had been conducting operations for an extended period. Most disturbing of all, its willingness to murder witnesses indicated that the stakes involved were high enough to justify extreme measures. By the time I reached my apartment, one fact had become crystal clear. I was now involved in something that was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined, and there was no possibility of returning to my previous life of simple woodland exploration and amateur investigation. The hunt had found me. The next 3 days passed in a state of hyper-vigilant tension that left me unable to eat, sleep, or focus on anything beyond the constant expectation of discovery. Every knock on my apartment door, every unexpected phone call, every unmarked vehicle parked on my street became a potential sign that the government hunters had identified me as a witness requiring elimination. I called in sick to work, claiming a severe case of food poisoning that would keep me home for the remainder of the week. Ingrid's irritated response suggested that my job security was becoming precarious, but employment concerns seemed trivial compared to the possibility that armed professionals might be tracking my movements and monitoring my communications. My apartment became a fortress of paranoia. I installed additional locks on the doors, covered the windows with newspapers to prevent surveillance from neighboring buildings, and moved my sleeping area to the bathroom where there were no external windows that could provide sniper angles. My police scanner ran constantly, monitoring emergency frequencies for any reports of unusual activity in the forest regions where I had been conducting my investigations. But it was the local news coverage that truly confirmed the scope of what I had witnessed. On the morning of September 18th, exactly 3 days after my encounter with the creature, the regional television station ran a brief story about a training exercise conducted by an unnamed government agency in the forests near the German border. The report featured carefully edited footage of military vehicles and armed personnel, but provided no details about the nature of the training or the specific agencies involved. More significant was what the report didn't mention. No acknowledgement of the gunshots that had echoed through the forest. No explanation for why a training exercise would require live ammunition. And no discussion of what, if anything, had been the target of the operation. The sanitized, information-free nature of the coverage suggested official control over what details were allowed to reach the public. The local newspaper's coverage was even more revealing in its deliberate vagueness. A single paragraph buried on page 7 mentioned that wildlife management specialists had been conducting routine population surveys in the affected area, with no mention of the military-style vehicles or armed personnel that I had observed. The story concluded with a statement that the surveys had been completed successfully and that normal public access to the forest would resume within a few days. I spent hours analyzing every word of these reports, searching for coded messages or hidden meanings that might reveal the true nature of the operation. The terminology was too carefully chosen, too deliberately non-specific, to be anything other than an official cover story designed to explain away activities that the public couldn't be allowed to understand. My attempts to research the creature's claims about working in Utrecht led to disturbing discoveries about the nature of professional life in the Netherlands. Over 40,000 people commuted daily from the surrounding rural areas to office jobs in the city, making it virtually impossible to identify one individual among such a massive population. More troubling was my realization that someone capable of switching between human and predatory forms could maintain a double existence indefinitely without detection, especially if they possessed the intelligence to carefully manage their hunting activities. The systematic nature of the sheep killings took on new meaning when viewed through this perspective. Rather than random predatory behavior, the killings represented calculated operations designed to satisfy biological needs while minimizing the risk of exposure. The creature had been managing its dual existence with the same professional competence it apparently brought to its office work, balancing the requirements of both identities with careful planning and execution. But my investigation had disrupted this balance, forcing the creature into direct contact with someone who could potentially expose its existence to authorities who were already tracking its activities. My months of amateur detective work had inadvertently triggered a confrontation that could have resulted in both our deaths. On the fourth day after my encounter, I made a decision that required more courage than anything I had done during my years of nocturnal forest exploration. I returned to the woods. The clearing where I had witnessed the creature's campsite showed no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred there. The fire pit had been completely dismantled, the stones scattered to create the appearance of natural geological formation. The areas where sheep carcasses had been arranged showed no traces of blood or disturbance, suggesting professional-level crime scene cleanup that had eliminated every possible piece of physical evidence. But the most significant discovery came when I examined the tree line around the clearing with the systematic thoroughness that my months of investigation had taught me. Buried beneath a thin layer of leaves and forest debris, I found 3 spent rifle cartridges from high-powered hunting rifles. The brass casings were clean and unmarked, suggesting military or law enforcement ammunition rather than civilian hunting supplies. The placement of the cartridges told a story that chilled me to the bone. They formed a rough triangle around the clearing, indicating that the shooters had positioned themselves to create a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. This hadn't been a tracking operation or an attempt at capture. This had been an execution squad positioned to eliminate their target with overwhelming firepower. But there was no blood, no drag marks, no indication that their target had been hit or killed during the operation. Either the creature had escaped the trap, or it possessed capabilities that made it effectively immune to conventional weapons. I spent 2 hours searching the surrounding area for additional evidence, following game trails and examining every tree and rock formation for signs of the creature's passage. What I found suggested that the government hunters had been correct about one thing. Their target possessed abilities that transcended normal biological limitations. Claw marks on tree trunks at heights that would require superhuman jumping ability. Footprints in soft earth that showed a stride length indicating movement at speeds that should have been impossible for any terrestrial animal. Most disturbing of all, areas where the vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that suggested the creature had been moving through the canopy, traveling from tree to tree at heights where ground-based pursuit would be impossible. The evidence painted a picture of something that could switch between human intelligence and predatory capabilities as circumstances required, adapting its behavior and physical abilities to match the threats it faced. The government hunters weren't simply tracking an unusual animal. They were pursuing something that could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and disappear into environments where their technology and training provided no advantages. As I prepared to leave the forest and return to the illusion of safety that my apartment provided, I discovered one final piece of evidence that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the situation I had become involved in. A small piece of paper, folded and wedged into the bark of a tree at exactly eye level for someone of my height. Inside, written in precise handwriting that could have belonged to any office worker in Utrecht, was a message that made my hands shake as I read it. They know about you now. Change your patterns, vary your routines, and trust no one in official positions. We may need to help each other survive what is coming. 6 months have passed since that night in the forest, and I am no longer the same person who began this investigation with the naive assumption that truth-seeking was a harmless intellectual exercise. The knowledge I have gained has transformed me in ways that go far beyond simple education. It has fundamentally altered my understanding of reality and my place within a world that operates according to rules far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. My life has become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create the appearance of normalcy, while concealing the truth that I am living under constant surveillance by forces that consider my continued existence a potential threat to national security. Every conversation is monitored, every movement tracked, every relationship analyzed for signs that I might be sharing information that could compromise operations I am not supposed to know exist. The transformation began with small changes that seemed insignificant until their cumulative effect became undeniable. My work performance, already deteriorating due to my nocturnal investigations, collapsed entirely as I struggled to concentrate on spreadsheets and quarterly reports while knowing that something capable of switching between human and predatory forms was sitting in an office somewhere in Utrecht, participating in the same mundane routines that had once defined my own existence. Ingrid called me into her office on a gray Tuesday morning in November, her expression carrying the satisfied look of someone who had been anticipating this moment for months. "Your productivity has declined to unacceptable levels," she announced, sliding a termination letter across her desk with barely concealed relief. "We're letting you go, effective immediately." I signed the paperwork without protest, knowing that unemployment would actually make surveillance of my activities more difficult for whoever was monitoring my daily routines. The loss of income was manageable. I had been living frugally for years, and my expenses were minimal compared to the value of maintaining operational security in an environment where a single mistake could result in my permanent disappearance. My apartment became a research facility dedicated to understanding the scope and nature of the forces that I had inadvertently discovered. Using techniques learned from conspiracy theory websites and counterintelligence manuals available online, I swept for listening devices and found 3 professionally installed bugs in locations that would capture conversations throughout my living space. Rather than removing them, I began feeding false information through carefully staged phone calls and conversations with imaginary visitors. The official surveillance was clumsy and obvious, suggesting either overconfidence or a deliberate strategy designed to make me aware of their presence. Unmarked vehicles parked outside my building for extended periods, the same individuals appearing in coffee shops and grocery stores where I conducted my daily business, and phone calls that featured suspicious delays and background noise indicating third-party monitoring. But the creature's surveillance was far more sophisticated. Items in my apartment were moved by millimeters, rearranged in ways that would be undetectable to official observers, but clearly visible to someone who knew exactly how everything had been positioned before leaving. Food disappeared from my refrigerator in quantities too small to represent normal consumption, but precise enough to indicate deliberate sampling. Most unnervingly, I would occasionally detect scents that didn't belong to my normal environment. The same musky, wild odor that I had encountered during our meeting in the forest. The message became clear. I was being protected by something that could enter my apartment at will, monitor my activities with supernatural precision, and eliminate any threats to my safety before I became aware of their existence. The government hunters might be watching my building, but they would never reach my apartment while the creature considered me an asset worth preserving. Communication between us developed through a system of coded messages that exploited the very surveillance network that was supposed to prevent unauthorized contact. Library books would be returned to shelves with specific pages marked, indicating meeting times and locations. Graffiti would appear on walls along my regular walking routes, providing updates on the status of the hunting operations and warnings about areas that had become too dangerous for civilian access. The most detailed information came through newspaper clippings that appeared in my mailbox, articles from regional publications that reported on events that seemed unrelated until viewed through the lens of knowledge that I possessed about the true nature of the situation. Stories about unexplained livestock deaths, reports of unusual wildlife behavior, and brief mentions of government research projects that provided fragments of a larger picture. The scope of the hunting operations was far more extensive than I had initially understood. At least 7 different agencies were involved in tracking and elimination efforts that spanned multiple countries across northern Europe. The creature I had encountered was not unique. It was part of a population that had been carefully monitored and systematically reduced through operations that were never acknowledged in official records. But the hunters were not winning. Reports filtered through the coded communication system indicating that their targets possessed adaptive capabilities that rendered traditional tracking and elimination methods increasingly ineffective. Creatures that had survived initial assassination attempts became more difficult to locate and more dangerous to pursue. Some had begun working together, sharing information, and coordinating activities in ways that suggested organizational capabilities beyond what their hunters had anticipated. The most disturbing revelation came through a newspaper clipping about a training accident at a military facility in Germany. 3 soldiers had been killed during a classified exercise, their bodies found in a condition that suggested attack by large predators. The official explanation blamed equipment malfunction and poor safety protocols, but the creature's marginalia noted that the soldiers had been part of a specialized hunting unit that had been tracking its activities for over a year. The war was escalating, and I was caught in the middle with knowledge that made me valuable to both sides while ensuring that neither could afford to let me live if the conflict reached a decisive phase. My response was to become someone that neither side could predict or control. I moved out of my apartment, using cash transactions and false identities to rent a series of short-term accommodations that made surveillance difficult to maintain. I varied my daily routines according to random patterns that prevented the establishment of trackable behaviors. Most importantly, I began documenting everything I had learned about the situation, creating multiple copies of my account that were hidden in locations that would ensure eventual disclosure if I disappeared. This document represents my insurance policy against elimination by forces that prefer to operate in secrecy. It contains enough specific information to compromise hunting operations while revealing the existence of capabilities that governments have been desperately trying to keep classified. Neither the official hunters nor their targets can afford to let this information become public, which means that my survival depends on maintaining a delicate balance that keeps both sides invested in my continued silence. But I am no longer content to remain a passive observer of events that will determine the future relationship between human civilization and forces that exist outside our normal understanding of the natural world. The creature was right when it observed that I seek truth even when it frightens me. The truth I have discovered is that we share our world with intelligence that operates according to different rules, and the attempts to suppress or eliminate that intelligence may be creating conditions for a conflict that could destroy the comfortable illusions that define modern society. I write this account not as a warning, but as preparation for a future where the boundaries between human and animal, between civilized and wild, between possible and impossible, will be redrawn by forces that we are only beginning to understand. The sheep killings were never random acts of predation. They were messages intended for those wise enough to recognize that something new was announcing its presence in our world. The hunt continues, but the roles of predator and prey are no longer as clear as they once seemed. And in the forests of the Dutch-German border, where ancient shadows move between the trees and modern surveillance technology fails to penetrate the deepest wilderness, the future is being written by intelligence that humanity has not yet learned to recognize or respect. I am no longer simply a witness to these events. I have become a participant in a story that will determine whether our species has the wisdom to adapt to a world far more complex and dangerous than we ever imagined, or whether our insistence on maintaining comfortable lives will lead us into a conflict that we cannot possibly win. The choice, as always, belongs to those brave enough to seek truth regardless of the consequences. The woods are waiting. Blood hammered in my ears from the moment I saw the torn uniform scraps strewn across that forest clearing. I had been searching for a missing hiker, but what I found was no ordinary mishap. The broken branches, the streaks of red on the tree bark, and the silence that fell over the pines told me everything I needed to know. We were dealing with something savage. My name is Jonas Carlisle, and I've spent 13 years with the United States Forest Service in northern Minnesota. Specifically, I work in search and rescue operations around the dense woodlands near Ely, Minnesota, a place most folks can't even find on a map. By April 2011, I'd witnessed my share of woodland tragedies: exposure victims with blue-tinged fingers, climbers with limbs bent at impossible angles, and the hollow stares of those who'd wandered too far from the trail and surrendered to the elements. But nothing prepared me for what happened during that unseasonably cold spring. The call came in just after 9 a.m. I was finishing paperwork at the ranger station when Renee, our dispatch coordinator, waved me over to her desk. Her usually relaxed expression had tightened into something more urgent. "Jonas, we've got a situation," she said, holding her headset away from one ear. "Day hiker radioed in about 20 minutes ago. Male, mid-30s, solo traveler named Michael Bennett. He was following the North Ridge Trail when something spooked him. Called in all panicky about footsteps, following him through a section where there shouldn't be other hikers." I leaned against her desk. "Maybe wildlife? Bear?" "That's what I figured at first," Renee said. But then his transmission cut to static. When it cleared, all we could hear was breathing, really fast like he was running. Then nothing. Radio's been dead since. I straightened up. "GPS coordinates?" "Last known position puts him about 4 miles northeast of Birch Creek Junction. That's pretty remote territory." She handed me a printout of the map with his last known location marked with a red X. I studied the topographical lines. The terrain there was rugged: sudden ravines, rocky outcroppings, and dense forest broken by small clearings. Not the kind of place where cell phones worked reliably, if at all. "I'll take Derek with me," I said. Derek Moore had been my search partner for 3 years. Former military, excellent outdoorsman, and level-headed in crisis situations. "Have you notified anyone else?" "County Sheriff's been alerted, but they're dealing with that multi-car pileup on Highway 23. They can't spare anyone for at least 4 hours. Local volunteers are assembling, should be ready by late afternoon." I nodded. "Keep trying the radio. If Bennett responds, tell him to stay put. We're on our way." 40 minutes later, Derek and I were parking the Forest Service truck at the North Ridge trailhead. We geared up in silence. Emergency packs, first aid supplies, water, navigation equipment, and our service sidearms. Standard procedure was to travel light for speed, but bring enough to survive the night if necessary. "What's your read on this one?" Derek asked as we checked our radios. His weathered face looked skeptical beneath his ranger hat. "Probably overreaction," I replied, adjusting my pack straps. "Guy hears a deer, gets spooked, maybe trips and damages his radio. We'll find him nursing a sprained ankle halfway down the trail." Derek nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "Radio going dead like that? Doesn't sit right with me." "Since when did you become superstitious?" I smiled, trying to ease the tension. "Not superstition. Statistics. Solo hikers who go radio silent after reporting something unusual. Those searches rarely end well." I couldn't argue with his logic. We'd both seen the pattern before. The trailhead sign warned hikers about mountain lion sightings in the area, though attacks were extremely rare. Below it, someone had posted a handwritten note about unusual animal tracks spotted 2 weeks prior. The ranger office should have been notified about that, but sometimes hikers preferred leaving cryptic warnings instead of filing proper reports. We set off at a brisk pace, wanting to cover ground quickly before daylight became an issue. April days in northern Minnesota were temperamental at best. Bright sunshine could give way to fog or freezing rain within hours. The forest that morning was unusually quiet. Most spring days, you'd hear woodpeckers drilling, squirrels chattering, and the constant movement of birds. That day, the woods seemed to be holding their breath. "Notice that?" Derek murmured after we'd been walking for about an hour. "The silence," I confirmed. "Makes my neck prickle," he admitted. We reached Bennett's last known coordinates around 11:30 a.m. The trail there curved around a large granite boulder, then split into two paths, the main trail continuing north, and a less maintained side trail heading east toward a series of small lakes. "Which way would you go?" I asked Derek, studying the fork. He crouched, examining the ground. "Main trail looks untouched. Side trail has some recent boot prints." He pointed to a partial impression in a patch of mud. "Men's hiking boot, probably size 11 or 12. Decent tread pattern, not worn down. Matches the description of Bennett's gear." "East it is," I said, and we turned onto the narrower path. The side trail quickly deteriorated, becoming overgrown in sections. Thorny bushes clawed at our pants, and low-hanging branches forced us to duck repeatedly. After another mile, the path opened into a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. And that's where we found the first disturbing sign. Shreds of bright blue fabric, the same color as the windbreaker Bennett was reported to be wearing, hung from branches at the edge of the clearing. They fluttered in the slight breeze like grotesque decorations. Nearby, a water bottle lay crushed, its contents spilled into the dirt. Derek knelt beside the fabric, touching one piece gingerly. "This wasn't torn by catching on branches, Jonas." "What do you mean?" "Look at the edges. Clean cuts, not rips or tears. Something sharp did this." He stood, scanning the ground. "And there's blood here." He was right. Small droplets of dried blood speckled the leaves and dirt near the water bottle. Not enough to suggest a serious injury, but definitely concerning. "Call it in," I told Derek. "Let Renee know we've found evidence of the missing hiker and possible signs of injury." As Derek radioed back to base, I circled the clearing slowly, looking for any trail leading away from it. Near the northern edge, partially hidden by ferns, I found what looked like drag marks, a narrow depression in the soft earth where something heavy had been pulled. "Derek," I called, "I think I've got something." He finished his transmission and joined me. Together, we stared at the faint trail leading deeper into the forest, away from any marked path. "That's not made by wildlife," Derek said quietly. "No," I agreed. "Let's follow it." The sun had risen high overhead, but beneath the dense canopy, shadows stretched like dark fingers across the forest floor. As we followed the drag marks, the air grew cooler, and the trees pressed closer together. Neither of us spoke much, listening instead for any sound that might indicate Bennett's presence. A call for help, movement in the underbrush, anything. After about half a mile, the drag marks disappeared at the edge of a steep embankment. Below, a narrow creek gurgled over smooth stones. We carefully made our way down, using tree roots as handholds. "Jonas?" Derek said suddenly, his voice tight. "Look at that." Across the creek, partially obscured by tall reeds, lay a single hiking boot. It stood upright, as if its owner had simply stepped out of it and walked away. The position was too deliberate, too unnatural to have occurred by accident. I felt the first real tingle of dread climb up my spine. Whatever had happened to Michael Bennett, it wasn't a simple hiking accident. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the dense shadows of the surrounding forest. We crossed the creek carefully, stepping on exposed rocks to avoid getting our boots wet. The water ran clear and cold, but something about its gentle murmuring seemed mocking rather than peaceful. Derek reached the boot first, crouching beside it as I kept watch on our surroundings. "Size 11 Merrill, matches what Bennett's family said he was wearing," Derek confirmed. "But Jonas, something's not right about this." "Besides the obvious?" I asked. "Look at how it's positioned, standing perfectly upright. Someone placed it like this deliberately. He gestured at the ground around it. And there are no tracks leading away. It's like it was dropped from above. I scanned the canopy overhead, half expecting to see something lurking in the branches, but there was nothing but leaves gently shifting in the breeze. Let's widen our search, I suggested. You take the left side of the creek, I'll take the right. Stay within visual contact. Derek nodded and moved away, his hand resting on his sidearm. I didn't comment on the gesture. My own hand had been hovering near my holster since we'd found the shredded windbreaker. I walked slowly along the right bank, scanning the ground methodically. 20 yards downstream, I found the first blood spatter. A dark stain on a gray rock that protruded from the water. More droplets led away from the creek and up a gentle slope covered in ferns and moss. "Derek," I called out, keeping my voice low. "Blood trail over here." He crossed back over the creek and joined me. Together, we followed the sporadic droplets, which gradually became more frequent. The forest grew denser, the trees older and wider, their massive trunks covered in thick moss. Shafts of sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a greenish twilight. The blood trail led us to a small, rocky outcrop, essentially a miniature cliff face about 15 feet high that jutted from the hillside. At its base, we found Bennett's backpack. Unlike the neatly placed boot, the pack had been savagely torn open. Its contents were scattered across the ground, energy bars with their wrappers shredded, a torn map, broken sunglasses, a first aid kit with its supplies strewn about. A high-end digital camera lay in pieces, its lens cracked and sensor exposed. "This wasn't animals," Derek muttered, picking up the camera body. "Look at these marks. Something with hands did this. Deliberate destruction." An unpleasant thought struck me. Could it be people? Maybe some backwoods types who don't like hikers on their territory? Derek considered this. Possible, but... He trailed off, looking troubled. "What?" "The way that boot was placed. The lack of footprints. It's too... ritualistic. Territorial disputes usually involve threats, warning shots, maybe some property damage. This feels different." I nodded, remembering cases I'd heard about from other ranger districts. Strange incidents where hikers reported being stalked, their camps disturbed in peculiar ways. Most were attributed to pranksters or wildlife, but a few remained unexplained. "Let's check the top of that outcrop," I suggested. "Might give us a better vantage point." We found a way up via a natural stone staircase of sorts on the left side. The top of the outcrop formed a flat shelf about 20 feet across, covered in pale lichen and stunted shrubs. From this height, we could see farther into the forest, though the dense canopy obscured much of the ground below. Derek walked to the edge, peering down. Suddenly, he became very still. "Jonas," he whispered, "come here." Slowly. Something in his tone made my heart rate spike. I moved carefully to join him at the edge, conscious of every sound my boots made on the stone surface. Below us, partially concealed by a tangle of berry bushes, was a small clearing. In its center lay a shape that took my brain several seconds to recognize. It was a body, or rather, what remained of one. The corpse was splayed out, arms and legs at unnatural angles. The clothing had been systematically removed, leaving only tatters clinging to the limbs. The skin was pale, almost gray, with long parallel gashes across the torso that exposed darker tissue beneath. The head was turned away from us, but even from our position, I could see that the back of the skull had been crushed. "That's Bennett," Derek said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. In 13 years of search and rescue, I'd seen death in many forms. Hypothermia victims peaceful in their final sleep, fall fatalities with their bodies broken on rocks, even the occasional suicide. But this was different. This was violence with purpose. "We need to call this in," I finally managed, reaching for my radio. "Get law enforcement out here. This is a crime scene now." Derek grabbed my wrist. "Wait!" he hissed. "Look there." He pointed to the far side of the clearing below us. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just shadows between the trees. Then something moved. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and impossibly thin. It seemed to shift between the trees with a fluid grace that reminded me of a predatory cat, except no cat stood on two legs like that. I couldn't make out details from our position, just a dark silhouette that seemed wrong somehow, proportions that didn't align with normal human anatomy. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Derek replied, "but it's coming back to the body." He was right. The figure was circling the clearing, moving closer to Bennett's remains with each silent step. We watched, frozen, as it reached the corpse and crouched beside it. From our angle, we could now see it better. Broad shoulders tapering to a too narrow waist, arms that hung almost to the ground, and a head that seemed elongated at the back. It reached out with one limb, I couldn't bring myself to call it a hand, and turned the body over. The movement was almost tender, like a parent checking a sleeping child. Then it bent lower, its face near Bennett's chest cavity. "It's feeding," Derek breathed, horror evident in every syllable. I fumbled for my sidearm, drawing it slowly to avoid making noise. Derek followed suit. We had standard-issue Glock 22s, reliable weapons, but suddenly they felt woefully inadequate. Below us, the figure stiffened. It raised its head sharply like an animal catching a scent. Then, with terrible deliberation, it turned its face upward, directly toward our position. I saw eyes then, reflective like a nocturnal animal's, catching what little light filtered through the trees. They fixed on us with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. This was no animal, at least not in the conventional sense. There was calculation in that gaze, a cold awareness that recognized us as intruders. For 3 heartbeats, we stared at each other across the vertical distance. Then, with a movement so swift it blurred, the figure sprinted away from the clearing, disappearing into the dense underbrush. "We need to go," Derek said, already backing away from the edge. "Now." I nodded, holstering my weapon with shaking hands. "Back to the main trail. We'll radio for backup once we're in the open." We descended from the outcrop as quickly as safety allowed, both of us scanning the trees constantly. The forest felt different now, not just silent but actively malevolent. Every shadow might conceal that tall, gaunt figure. Every rustle of leaves could signal its approach. We retraced our steps to the creek, moving as quietly as possible while maintaining speed. The boot still stood upright on the bank, a macabre signpost that now seemed like a deliberate mockery. "Should we take it, as evidence?" Derek asked. "Leave it," I replied. "This is a crime scene. Let the forensic team handle it." We crossed the creek again and started up the embankment. The climb was steeper than I remembered, forcing us to use both hands to pull ourselves up by roots and rocks. Derek reached the top first and extended his hand to help me up the final few feet. As I grasped his hand, I heard a soft sound behind me, something between a sigh and a hiss. I turned my head, still clinging to the embankment. Standing in the middle of the creek, water swirling around its lower limbs, was the figure. In the open, I could see it clearly for the first time, and my mind rebelled at the details. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs too long and jointed in places human limbs shouldn't bend. The skin was a patchwork, mostly hairless and gray-white, but with areas of what looked like coarse dark fur on the shoulders and down the spine. The face? I try not to remember the face, with its too wide jaw and eyes that reflected green in the filtered sunlight. "Run!" I shouted, scrambling up the remaining distance. Derek hauled me over the edge, and we both took off through the forest, abandonment caution for speed. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, Not heavy footfalls, but a strange scuttling noise, punctuated by the crack of breaking branches. We sprinted toward where we thought the main trail should be, ducking under low limbs and leaping over fallen logs. My lungs burned and sweat stung my eyes, but pure animal terror kept my legs pumping. "There," Derek gasped, pointing ahead where the underbrush thinned. We broke through onto the main trail, instantly changing direction to head back toward the trailhead. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing visible, but the forest seemed to pulse with tension, as if holding its breath. We ran for another 100 yards before Derek stumbled, catching himself against a tree trunk. We both paused, gasping for air, listening intently for any sound of pursuit. "I think we lost it," Derek managed between breaths. I nodded, unable to speak yet. My hand found my radio, and I keyed the transmitter. "Base, this is Carlisle. Emergency situation on North Ridge Trail. We've found Bennett. He's deceased. Signs of violent death." I paused, uncertain how to describe what we'd seen. "We encountered a hostile presence in the area, requesting immediate backup and law enforcement support. Over." The radio crackled with static before Renee's voice came through, laced with concern. "Understood, Jonas. Your position?" "Approximately 2 miles from the trailhead on the main North Ridge path, heading back now. The body is about half a mile east of the trail fork near coordinate marker 15. "Copy that. Sheriff's deputies are being dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. Continue to trailhead if safe to do so." "Copy. Out." I clipped the radio back to my belt. 40 minutes. Derek wiped sweat from his forehead. "Think we're safe on the main trail?" I considered this. Whatever that thing was, it had seemed cautious about open spaces, preferring to stalk through the dense forest. "Safer, at least. Let's keep moving, but at a sustainable pace. Keep our eyes open." We started walking briskly along the trail, both of us scanning the tree line constantly. The main path was wide enough that anything approaching would be visible before it reached us, which provided some comfort. After about 15 minutes of walking, Derek broke the tense silence. "What was that thing, Jonas?" I shook my head. "I don't know. Some kind of... I don't even have a word for it. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not anything I've ever seen in these woods." "No," I agreed. "Not anything that should exist." Derek glanced nervously at the dense foliage to our right. "You think it's still following us?" Before I could answer, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest to our left. We both froze, turning toward the sound. The dense undergrowth revealed nothing, but I sensed movement just beyond visual range, a darker shadow shifting among the natural shadows of the trees. "It's paralleling the trail," I whispered, "staying just out of sight." Derek drew his sidearm again. "Why doesn't it attack? It has the advantage." The question chilled me more than the creature's presence. It implied calculation, strategy, qualities that belong to hunters with intelligence, not mere predatory instinct. "Maybe it's waiting for something," I said, the words feeling ominous as they left my mouth. As if in response, a heavy cloud passed overhead, casting the forest into deeper shadow. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in seconds. "Keep moving," I urged. "Steadily. Don't run unless I say so." We continued down the trail, walking side by side now, both facing outward, Derek watching the left side, me the right. Occasionally, we'd hear subtle sounds from the forest, a rustle here, a soft thud there, always matching our pace. The trail curved ahead, winding around a massive boulder formation. As we approached the bend, my instinct screamed a warning. The corner created a natural choke point, forcing us momentarily closer to the tree line. "Be ready," I murmured to Derek. "When we round that corner..." I never finished the sentence. From directly overhead came a heavy thud as something landed on the trail behind us. We whirled around, weapons raised. The creature stood fully upright, blocking the path we'd just traveled. In the unfiltered daylight of the open trail, its wrongness was even more apparent. It was gaunt to the point of emaciation, the skin pulled tight over visible bones, yet the shoulders and chest suggested immense strength. The arms hung almost to the knees, ending in hands with elongated fingers tipped with black, curved claws. But it was the face that haunted me most. A distorted, elongated skull with skin stretched taut, no visible nose except for 2 slits, and a mouth that split the lower portion of the face in a lipless line. The eyes were large, reflective orbs that seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it. For one endless moment, we stared at each other. 2 forest rangers face to face with something that defied classification. Then Derek fired. The report was deafening in the forest quiet. The creature jerked as the bullet struck its shoulder, a dark fluid seeping from the wound. It made no sound, no howl of pain, no roar of anger, just fixed us with those terrible eyes. Then it charged. The creature moved with impossible speed, crossing the distance between us in what seemed like a single bound. Derek fired again, the bullet striking the thing's chest without slowing its advance. I raised my own weapon and squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. At least one shot connected, tearing through the creature's side, but it barely registered the injury. Before I could fire again, it was upon us, one elongated arm swinging in a vicious arc toward Derek. He tried to dodge, but those unnaturally long limbs gave the creature reach we hadn't anticipated. Curved claws raked across Derek's chest, shredding his uniform shirt and the flesh beneath. He cried out, stumbling backward and falling to the ground. I fired again, this time aiming for the head. The creature twisted with unnatural flexibility, the bullet grazing its elongated skull instead of penetrating. It turned those absorbing eyes toward me, and I saw something there beyond animal instinct, a calculating intelligence that assessed me as the greater threat now that Derek was down. It lunged. I dove sideways, feeling the air displacement as those claws missed my face by inches. Rolling to my feet, I fired my remaining rounds in quick succession. 2 missed entirely, but the third struck the creature's knee, causing it to falter momentarily. That brief hesitation gave me the chance to reach Derek. Blood soaked his shredded shirt, but he was conscious, his eyes wide with pain and fear. "Can you move?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. He nodded grimly, struggling to his feet with my help. The creature was recovering its balance, that terrible head swiveling to track our movements. "Run!" I shouted, supporting Derek as we lurched toward the bend in the trail. Behind us, I heard a sound like wood splintering as the creature launched itself forward again. We rounded the boulder, temporarily breaking its line of sight. The trail ahead sloped downward, offering slightly easier travel for Derek's injured state. The rock formation, Derek gasped through gritted teeth, might be defensible. He was right. About 50 yards ahead, the trail passed through a natural corridor formed by 2 massive rock walls, essentially a miniature canyon about 20 feet long and 8 feet wide. If we could reach it, the narrow passage would negate the creature's advantage of speed and reach, forcing it to confront us directly. We staggered forward, Derek leaning heavily on my shoulder. Behind us came that strange, scuttling sound. Not quite footsteps, more like something alternating between bipedal and quadrupedal movement. It was gaining on us rapidly. "Go," Derek suddenly said, pushing away from me. "I'm slowing you down." "Not happening," I replied, gripping his arm tighter. "We're almost there." The entrance to the rock corridor loomed ahead. 10 more yards. 5. Then we were through, the natural stone walls rising on either side of us. I helped Derek lean against the left wall while I reloaded my weapon with shaking hands, dropping several bullets before managing to fill the magazine. At the entrance to the corridor, a shadow appeared. The creature stood motionless, those reflective eyes studying us and the narrow passage. It seemed to be considering its options, perhaps recognizing the tactical disadvantage. "It's thinking," Derek whispered, the wonder in his voice evident despite his pain. "Actually thinking through strategy." I raised my reloaded weapon, aiming carefully. "Let's see if it thinks about this." I fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The confined space amplified the gunshots to painful levels, the sound reverberating off the stone walls like physical blows. 2 bullets struck the creature's torso, causing it to stagger backward out of sight. For several tense seconds, we waited, listening for movement. Nothing. Had we driven it off? Wounded it severely enough that it retreated? "Think we got it?" Derek asked hoarsely. Before I could answer, a dark shape appeared at the top of the rock wall to our right, not at the entrance of the corridor, but halfway along its length. The creature had climbed the 15-foot vertical stone face and was now perched above us, preparing to drop down. "Move!" I shouted, pulling Derek toward the exit end of the corridor. We'd barely taken 2 steps when the creature landed in the narrow passage behind us. The impact seemed to shake the very ground. It crouched momentarily, then rose to its full height, now between us and the trail back to the trailhead. I aimed and fired again, but the creature was already moving, lunging forward with those impossibly long arms extended. I felt claws catch my sleeve, tearing the fabric but missing flesh as I twisted away. Derek stumbled, falling against the opposite wall, his face pale with blood loss. In the confined space, the creature couldn't use its speed advantage fully, but those reaching limbs still gave it a terrifying edge. It slashed again, forcing me to press flat against the stone to avoid being disemboweled. The claws struck sparks from the rock inches from my face. Derek had drawn his sidearm again and fired from his position on the ground. The shot went wide, striking the wall near the creature's head, sending stone fragments flying. But the loud report in the enclosed space seemed to disorient the thing momentarily. It shook its elongated head, taking a half-step backward. I seized the opportunity, lunging forward and firing at point-blank range into its torso. The impact drove it back another step. Dark fluid, too dark and thick to be blood, at least not human blood, oozed from multiple wounds now. Its breathing had changed, becoming more labored, with a wet, rattling quality. "It can be hurt," I said, more to reassure myself than anything. The creature regarded us with what I could only interpret as hatred. Then it did something that chilled me to the bone. It lowered itself into a crouch, not as if wounded, but as if preparing to spring. "Dodge left," I told Derek tersely. The creature launched itself forward in an explosive burst. I dove left, Derek rolled right, and the thing shot between us, unable to adjust its trajectory in the narrow space. It crashed into the rock wall at the end of the corridor with a sickening thud. For a moment, it lay stunned, limbs splayed awkwardly. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Derek by his good arm and hauling him up. "Out! Now!" I urged, and we staggered toward the entrance of the corridor. Behind us, I heard movement as the creature recovered. We burst out of the rock passage onto the open trail, immediately veering into the forest on the opposite side. The dense undergrowth would slow us down, but it might also make it harder for the creature to track us. We pushed through ferns and brambles, ignoring the scratches from thorns and branches. Derek was weakening visibly, his face ashen, but determination kept him moving. I supported him as best I could while trying to maintain a zigzagging path through the trees. "Radio," Derek gasped after several minutes. "Call position." He was right. The deputies would be searching for us, possibly heading toward Bennett's body, rather than our current location. I pulled my radio from my belt, relieved to find it still functional despite everything. "Base, this is Carlisle. Be advised, we've been forced off the main trail by a hostile entity. Moore is injured. We're approximately 1 mile from the trailhead, moving through the forest parallel to the trail on the west side. The assailant is still in pursuit. We need immediate extraction." "Over," The response came through broken and staticky. Copy that. Deputies on main trail. Helicopter, position. They're sending help, I told Derek. Helicopter's coming. We just need to find a clearing for extraction. He nodded weakly. The front of his uniform was now soaked crimson, and his steps were becoming increasingly unsteady. We continued through the forest, listening constantly for signs of pursuit. Occasionally, we'd hear distant noises, branches breaking, undergrowth rustling, but never close enough to pinpoint a direction. It felt like we were being stalked, the creature circling and waiting for an opportunity rather than charging in blindly. After what seemed like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, we stumbled upon a small clearing, not much larger than a typical suburban backyard, but possibly big enough for a skilled helicopter pilot to attempt a landing. Here, I said, helping Derek to the center of the open space. We'll make our stand here. I eased him down to a sitting position against a fallen log, then quickly checked his wounds. 3 deep gashes ran diagonally across his chest, from shoulder to mid-torso. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and the edges of the wounds showed an unusual discoloration, a grayish tinge that worried me. How bad? Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You'll live, I lied, forcing confidence into my voice. Help's coming. I keyed my radio again. Base, this is Carlisle. We've reached a small clearing approximately 1 mile from the trailhead, just west of the main path. Requesting immediate helicopter extraction. Moore's condition is deteriorating. Over. This time, the response was clearer. Copy that, Carlisle. Helicopter is en route to your GPS coordinates. ETA 7 minutes. Deputies are also converging on your location on foot. Hold position. Copy out. I turned to Derek. 7 minutes, just hang on. He nodded weakly, then his eyes widened, focusing on something behind me. Jonas. I whirled around, raising my weapon. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a large pine, stood the creature. It made no move to approach, simply watching us with those terrible reflective eyes. Dark fluid still seeped from its wounds, but its posture showed no sign of weakness or pain. I see it, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the thing. Don't move. For nearly a minute, we remained in this tense standoff. The creature motionless at the forest's edge, me with my weapon trained on its torso, and Derek bleeding against the log. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the cool spring air. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, came the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades. Relief flooded through me, almost making my knees buckle. The creature heard it too. Its head tilted upward, tracking the sound with obvious intelligence. Then those reflective eyes returned to us, seeming to calculate, to decide. It stepped fully into the clearing. I fired immediately, the bullet striking its shoulder. It flinched but continued forward, its gait changing to something low and predatory. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but doing little to slow its advance. The helicopter sounds grew louder, now accompanied by shouting voices from the direction of the trail. The deputies, finally arriving. The creature paused, head swiveling between us and the new sounds. Suddenly, the forest to our right erupted with activity as 3 uniformed deputies pushed through the undergrowth, weapons drawn. They froze momentarily at the sight of the creature, their expressions shifting from professional determination to naked shock. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted. The creature's reaction was immediate. It abandoned its approach toward us, instead sprinting with that unnatural speed toward the deputies. They opened fire in unison, the combined gunshots deafening in the small clearing. Multiple bullets struck the creature, dark fluid spraying from new wounds across its torso and limbs. It faltered, stumbling mid-stride, then veered away from both groups of humans. With what looked like a final surge of desperate energy, it bounded back into the forest, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. The deputies rushed forward, two maintaining their aim at where the creature had vanished. The third, a woman with sergeant's stripes, kneeling beside Derek. "We need immediate medical evacuation," she barked into her radio, examining Derek's wounds. "What the hell did this to him?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I replied, the adrenaline finally ebbing and leaving me shaky and exhausted. Above us, the helicopter appeared, hovering over the small clearing and stirring the trees into a frenzy of movement. Finding it too small to land, the pilot maintained position while lowering a rescue basket. Working together, we secured Derek in the basket, his face now gray and his breathing shallow. As the winch began to lift him toward the helicopter, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "It's still out there, Jonas," he whispered. "It knows who we are now." I nodded, unable to find words as the basket continued its ascent. The sergeant approached me, her expression grim. "You need medical attention too," she said, eyeing the various cuts and bruises I'd accumulated during our flight. "I'm fine," I replied automatically. "But whatever that thing was, it's injured and dangerous. We need to organize a proper hunt before nightfall." She studied my face, perhaps trying to determine if I was in shock. "The sheriff and state police are setting up a command post at the trailhead. Additional rangers and wildlife officers are en route." She paused. "Can you tell me what we're dealing with here? Some kind of bear? Mountain lion?" I looked toward where the creature had disappeared, remembering those reflective, intelligent eyes. "No," I said finally. "Nothing like that. Nothing I've ever seen before." The thrum of the helicopter grew louder as it repositioned to extract us next. As I waited for the basket to return, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkening forest, those unnatural eyes were still watching, still calculating, still planning its next move. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. After being airlifted out of the forest clearing, I was taken to Ely Regional Hospital for examination. The doctors found no serious injuries, just cuts, bruises, and mild dehydration, but insisted on keeping me for observation due to potential shock. From my hospital bed, I gave my official statement to Sheriff James Gallagher, a weather-beaten man with 30 years of law enforcement experience. He listened without interruption as I recounted finding Bennett's remains and our subsequent encounter with the creature. When I finished, he remained silent for several long moments, his expression unreadable. "You understand how this sounds, Carlyle?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir. I do. If I didn't have 3 of my deputies corroborating at least part of your story, I'd be ordering a psych evaluation right now." He sighed, rubbing his face wearily. "As it is, we have a dead hiker, a severely injured forest ranger, and multiple officers reporting some kind of unidentified predator." "How is Derek?" I asked, the question I'd been desperate to ask since arriving at the hospital. Gallagher's expression softened slightly. "In surgery. The wounds were deep, but the doctors are optimistic. Strange thing, though. They reported some kind of unusual contamination in the lacerations. They've sent samples to the state lab for analysis." A chill ran through me, remembering the grayish tinge I'd noticed at the edges of Derek's wounds. "Sheriff," I said carefully, "whatever that thing is, it's not just physically dangerous. There's something else about it. Something wrong." "We've organized a search party," he replied, ignoring my cryptic warning. "State police, wildlife officers, my deputies, and some of your fellow rangers. They're going to find Bennett's body and track this predator." "You can't send them out there without proper preparation," I protested, sitting up despite the pain that flared across my bruised ribs. "That thing is intelligent. It adapts. It strategizes." Gallagher studied me for a moment. "The search team is heavily armed, Carlyle. They're carrying rifles, not just sidearms. If this creature is still in the area, they'll handle it. I wanted to argue further, to make him understand that conventional weapons might not be enough, but exhaustion was claiming me, making my thoughts fuzzy and disjointed. "Get some rest," the sheriff said, standing to leave. "I'll update you when the search team reports back." After he left, I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with elongated limbs and reflective eyes watching from the darkness between trees. I woke fully around dusk as a nurse came to check my vitals. "How's Ranger Moore?" I asked immediately. "He's out of surgery," she replied, checking my blood pressure. "Still in critical condition, but stable for now. The doctor can give you more details in the morning." After she left, I lay in the gathering darkness, listening to the hospital sounds outside my door. The logical part of my brain tried to make sense of what we'd encountered, a mutated bear perhaps, or some undocumented predator that had migrated into the region. But deeper instincts rejected these explanations, recognizing something fundamentally wrong about the creature that transcended biological classification. My troubled thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of my phone on the bedside table. It was a text from Renee at dispatch. "Search team lost radio contact 30 minutes ago. Sheriff requesting you call ASAP." My heart sank as I dialed Gallagher's number. He answered on the first ring. "Carlisle, how mobile are you?" "I can walk," I replied, already swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "What's happened?" "Search team reached Bennett's location and confirmed your description of the scene. They were tracking what they believed to be the injured predator when we lost contact. Last transmission mentioned unusual movement in the trees above them." I closed my eyes briefly. They didn't listen. It adapts its hunting strategy. "I need you at the command post," Gallagher continued, ignoring my comment. "You're the only one who's encountered this thing and made it out. We're organizing a rescue operation and I want your input." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, already looking for my clothes. Against medical advice, I checked myself out of the hospital and caught a ride to the trailhead with a deputy. Night had fallen completely by the time we arrived, the forest a wall of impenetrable darkness beyond the harsh glare of portable floodlights. The command post buzzed with tense activity. Officers and rangers huddled over maps, radio operators trying repeatedly to contact the missing search team, and medical personnel standing by with grim expressions. Sheriff Gallagher met me at the edge of the activity, his face lined with worry. "Glad you're here, Carlisle. Situation's deteriorating fast." "Have you considered calling in state or federal resources?" I asked, scanning the assembled personnel. There were perhaps 20 people total, not nearly enough for what we were facing. "Already did. State Police Tactical Unit is en route, ETA 90 minutes. I've also got a call into the Department of Natural Resources for wildlife specialists." "And the missing team?" 6 personnel, 2 of my deputies, 2 state police officers, and 2 of your fellow rangers. Last known position was near where you reported finding Bennett's body. They'd been following a blood trail, presumably from the creature you wounded." I nodded, trying to think tactically despite the fear gnawing at my gut. "If we're going after them, we need to change our approach. No small teams. Move as a single unit, and we need better weapons." Gallagher led me to a table where a Forest Service map was spread out, weighted down with rocks at the corners. "The tactical team will bring heavier firepower. For now, we've got shotguns and hunting rifles in addition to service weapons." I studied the map, locating the outcrop where Derek and I had first spotted the creature, and the creek where we'd found the boot. "It knows these woods better than we do. It used the trees for ambush against the search team. We need to stay in open areas where possible. Avoid dense cover." "You're talking about it like it's thinking, planning," one of the rangers commented, skepticism evident in his tone. I met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what it's doing. This isn't just an animal acting on instinct. It learns, it adapts. It recognized the threat of our weapons and changed its tactics accordingly." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Gallagher spoke. "Carlyle, I need you to be absolutely clear. What exactly do you think we're dealing with here?" I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "I don't know what it is. It's shaped roughly like a human, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that don't make sense. It moves faster than anything I've ever seen, and it's strong enough to—" I trailed off, remembering what it had done to Bennett's body. "And you're certain it's not a bear or other known predator?" Gallagher pressed. "Absolutely certain," I replied without hesitation. "Bears don't climb vertical rock faces in seconds. They don't strategize or set traps, and they don't have eyes that watch you with calculation and hatred." The silence that followed was broken by the crackle of a radio. Everyone tensed, turning toward the communications desk where an operator was adjusting dials. "Repeat last transmission," the operator said urgently. "You're breaking up." Through bursts of static came a fragmented voice. "Ambushed. 3 down. Can't see where. Coming from the trees." "That's Decker," one of the deputies said, identifying his colleague's voice. "They're still alive." The transmission continued, more static than words now. "Not animal. Oh God, it's position Fox 7. Need immediate." Then silence. The radio operator tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but there was no response. Gallagher turned to the assembled group, his decision made. "We're mounting a rescue operation immediately. Full team, maximum firepower. Carlyle, you're with me as consultant only. You're not fully recovered and not officially on duty." I started to protest, but realized he was right. In my current state, I might be more liability than asset. "I need a radio and sidearm at minimum," I insisted, "and I'm staying with the command team." He nodded curtly, then addressed the group. "We move in 15 minutes. Check your gear, comms, and ammunition. This is a rescue mission, but be prepared for hostile contact." As the team dispersed to prepare, I pulled Gallagher aside. "Sheriff, there's something else you should know. When that thing injured Derek, the wounds showed unusual discoloration. The doctors mentioned contamination. I think its claws might carry some kind of toxin." He frowned. "All the more reason for caution. I'll inform the medics." The next 15 minutes passed in a flurry of preparation. I was issued a radio and a Glock similar to my service weapon, which I hoped I wouldn't need to use. The rescue team assembled, 12 personnel total, including Gallagher and myself. The remaining officers would maintain the command post and coordinate with incoming state resources. Just before we departed, I visited the medical tent where the team's 2 paramedics were checking their kits. "If you encounter anyone with claw wounds," I told them, "be extremely careful with the wounds. There may be a toxic or infectious agent present. Use full protective gear." They exchanged glances but nodded seriously. Word had spread quickly about the unusual circumstances, and no one was taking chances. At 9:45 p.m., our group set out along the main trail, powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. The night was unusually still. No wind stirred the branches, and the typical forest sounds were absent. It felt as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. We moved in tight formation. 2 officers on point, the main group in a loose cluster, and 2 rangers bringing up the rear. Every few minutes, the radio operator with us would attempt to contact the missing team, but there was never any response. As we approached the trail fork where Derek and I had first turned off the main path, tensions visibly increased. Flashlight beams swept constantly from side to side, scanning the surrounding forest. Above us, the tree canopy created a ceiling of darkness, branches occasionally shifting against the night sky, though there was no wind. Movement. One of the officers on point suddenly whispered, his rifle coming up to his shoulder. Everyone froze, lights converging on where he was pointing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a shadow seemed to detach itself from a tree trunk about 30 yards ahead. flowing with liquid grace to another position before vanishing completely. "Spread out," Gallagher ordered quietly. "Create a perimeter. Nothing gets past us." The team reorganized into a rough circle, all facing outward with weapons ready. I stood near the center with Gallagher and the radio operator, my borrowed Glock feeling woefully inadequate. "Could be wildlife," one of the rangers suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Not moving like that," another replied. For several minutes, we maintained position, scanning the darkness. Occasionally, someone would report movement in their sector, but nothing definitive, just shadows shifting in ways that might have been tricks of the light or genuine threats. "We can't stay here all night," Gallagher finally said. "We need to push forward to the last known position of the search team." He was right, but every instinct screamed that moving deeper into the forest was walking into a trap. I was about to share this concern when a sound froze the blood in my veins. A long, low wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite human, nor was it like any animal call I'd ever heard. It resonated with a quality that made my teeth ache and the hairs on my arms stand up. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. No one answered because no one knew. The sound came again, closer this time, and distinctly from our left. All flashlights swung in that direction, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Move out," Gallagher ordered, his voice tight. "Keep formation. Head toward checkpoint Fox 7. We advanced slowly, everyone on high alert. The trail narrowed as we approached the area where Derek and I had first left it to follow the drag marks. I pointed this out to Gallagher, and he nodded grimly. "According to your report, the body was found east of here, down an embankment and across a creek. Yes, there should be signs of the first search team passing through. Broken branches, footprints." He directed the point officers to look for such signs, and soon they found them. Multiple boot prints in the soft earth leading away from the trail in the same direction Derek and I had gone earlier that day. We followed this new trail, moving even more cautiously now. The terrain became increasingly difficult. The same steep embankment, the same shallow creek. At the water's edge, several officers paused, scanning the opposite bank with their lights. "The boot is gone," I noted, indicating where Derek and I had found Bennett's hiking boot standing upright. "Could the search team have taken it as evidence?" Gallagher asked. "Possibly," I conceded, though something about it felt wrong. We crossed the creek and began ascending the opposite slope, following the clear trail left by the search team. Their boot prints showed they'd been moving quickly, not taking the care to be quiet that we were now. At the top of the slope, we found the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. A state police officer's cap lay on the ground, surrounded by what looked like struggle marks in the dirt and fallen leaves. Nearby, a flashlight had been dropped, its beam still weakly illuminating a patch of ferns. "Form a search grid," Gallagher ordered. "Look for blood, shell casings, anything that might tell us what happened." The team spread out, methodically examining the area. I moved toward where I remembered the rocky outcrop should be, my flashlight beam playing over the ground. Near the base of the outcrop, I found spent shell casings, a lot of them, indicating multiple weapons had been fired. "Sheriff," I called, keeping my voice low. "Evidence of gunfire here." Gallagher joined me, crouching to examine the casings. Different calibers, they all fired, but no blood, no bodies. "They might have retreated," I suggested, though without much hope. "Or been taken." His expression darkened at the implication. Taken where, and by what? Before I could respond, one of the rangers called out from several yards away. "I've got a blood trail. Not human, I think. Too dark." We converged on his position. He was right. Dark, almost black fluid spattered across leaves and tree bark, leading away from the area of gunfire toward a dense thicket of old-growth trees. "Same kind of fluid I saw coming from the creature when we shot it," I confirmed. Gallagher considered our options. If it's injured, it might have retreated to wherever it lairs, and it might have taken our people with it. Or killed them and took the remains, I said, unable to avoid thinking of what we'd seen it doing to Bennett's body. The sheriff's jaw tightened. We follow the trail. Maximum caution. No one separates from the group for any reason. We tracked the dark fluid through increasingly dense forest. The old-growth section was predominantly pine and hemlock, massive trunks rising like columns into the darkness above. Our flashlight beams seemed swallowed by the immensity, barely penetrating 20 feet ahead. The blood trail became more sporadic, suggesting the creature's wounds were clotting, or it was moving more carefully to avoid leaving a trail. After about a quarter mile, we reached an area where the forest floor dipped into a shallow depression filled with ferns and moss. The blood trail disappeared completely at the edge. "Search the perimeter," Gallagher ordered. "It has to continue somewhere." The team spread out around the depression, examining the ground carefully. I moved slightly apart from the others, scanning my section methodically. That's when I noticed something odd about one of the large pines at the far edge. A dark vertical line running up its trunk that didn't match the natural pattern of the bark. I approached cautiously, my flashlight focused on the anomaly. As I drew closer, I realized what I was seeing. A narrow opening, almost like a crude door, cut into the massive trunk. The edges were rough, as if torn rather than cut, and the dark fluid we'd been tracking was smeared around the opening. "Sheriff," I called, keeping my voice low but urgent. "I think I found something." Gallagher appeared at my side, his expression changing from questioning to alarm as he saw what I was indicating. He signaled the rest of the team to approach quietly. As they gathered around, we all stared at the opening with a mixture of confusion and dread. It was roughly 7 feet tall and perhaps 3 feet wide, large enough for a human to pass through sideways, or for something long-limbed and thin to enter easily. "What the hell?" one of the deputies muttered. "Trees don't just split open like that." "This one didn't," I replied, pointing to marks around the edges that looked disturbingly like claw gouges. "Something made this." Gallagher directed his flashlight beam into the opening. The interior of the trunk was hollow, far larger than seemed possible given the tree's exterior dimensions. The beam revealed a smooth-sided shaft descending steeply into darkness below the forest floor. "That's not natural," one of the rangers stated unnecessarily. "Old-growth pines don't hollow out like this." "No," I agreed, a terrible suspicion forming. "They don't." Gallagher turned to the radio operator. "Contact base. Report our position and this discovery. Request the tactical team proceed directly to our location when they arrive." While the operator relayed the message, the sheriff addressed the group. "We've potentially located the creature's lair. Given the unnatural nature of this finding, I'm ordering extreme caution. We'll establish a perimeter and wait for backup before attempting any exploration." I should have felt relief at his prudent decision. But something nagged at me. A sense that time was crucial, that waiting might mean death for the missing search team if they were still alive. "Sheriff," I said quietly, "if our people are down there and injured, they might not have hours to wait." He regarded me steadily. "I understand your concern, Carlyle, but I'm not sending anyone into that, whatever it is, without proper backup and equipment. The tactical team will have body armor, night vision, and heavy weapons." I nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right, but hating the delay nonetheless. We began establishing a secure perimeter around the tree, positioning officers in a rough circle facing outward, with 2 medics and the radio operator in the center near the aberrant opening. As we settled into position, that strange wailing sound came again. Fainter now, but seemingly from multiple directions at once. Everyone tensed, weapons ready, scanning the darkness between the massive tree trunks. "It's trying to unnerve us," I said to Gallagher, who had taken position near me. Psychological tactics. He gave me a sidelong glance. You're still talking about it like it's thinking, planning. Because it is, I replied simply. Everything we've seen points to intelligence, not just instinct. The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. We maintained our vigilant perimeter, rotating positions occasionally to keep everyone fresh and alert. The tactical team was delayed by weather conditions. Their ETA pushed back repeatedly. Throughout the night, we experienced disturbing phenomena around our position. Shadows moved between distant trees in ways that defied natural explanation. The wailing sounds came and went, sometimes seeming to emanate from directly beneath our feet. Twice, officers reported seeing reflective eyes watching from the darkness, only to have them vanish when flashlight beams swung in their direction. Around 3 a.m., one of the deputies who had been staring intently at the opening in the tree called for Gallagher. We both moved to his position. Something's changed, he said, pointing his flashlight at the opening. He was right. The edges of the unnatural doorway had shifted somehow. What had been a clean, if ragged, vertical opening now had an irregular pattern along one side, almost like teeth. That's impossible, Gallagher muttered. We've been watching it continuously. But there it was. Undeniable evidence that the opening was changing, morphing into something even more unnatural. And now that my attention was focused on it, I noticed something else. A faint, rhythmic movement of the edges, almost like breathing. We need to pull back, I said, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. Right now. Gallagher hesitated only briefly before nodding. Everyone, fall back 20 yards. Maintain the perimeter at wider range. As the team began to withdraw, a low, vibrating hum emanated from the opening. Not a sound made by anything living, but more like the resonance of something massive shifting beneath the earth. The forest floor trembled slightly, pine needles dancing on the ground. Then, from the darkness of the opening, came a sound that froze us all in place. A human voice, weak but distinct. Help. Please. Anybody. That's Decker. The same deputy who had identified the voice on the radio earlier exclaimed, "He's alive!" Before anyone could react, a figure stumbled from the opening. A man in a torn state police uniform, covered in dirt and dark stains. He fell to his knees just outside the tree, one arm clutched across his torso. 2 officers rushed forward to help him, but I shouted a warning. "Wait! Something's wrong!" They hesitated, looking back at me in confusion. I pointed my flashlight directly at the fallen officer's face, revealing what my instincts had already sensed. His eyes were wrong, reflecting the light with the same oily sheen I'd seen in the creature's gaze. "That's not Decker," I said firmly. As if triggered by my words, the figure's head snapped up, its mouth opening far wider than humanly possible to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Its limbs elongated with sickening cracking sounds, clothes tearing as the human disguise fell away to reveal the same gaunt, pale creature that had pursued Derek and me earlier. The nearest officers opened fire immediately, bullets tearing into the transforming figure. It jerked with each impact but didn't fall. Instead, it launched itself forward with that unnatural speed, claws extended toward the closest deputy. He managed to dive sideways, avoiding the full force of the attack, but those elongated fingers caught his leg, ripping through pants and flesh. His scream tore through the night as he was dragged toward the tree opening. 3 officers fired simultaneously, their bullets striking the creature's spine and skull. Dark fluid sprayed across the forest floor, and the thing finally released its victim, writhing in what appeared to be genuine pain. "Keep firing," Gallagher ordered, his own weapon discharging repeatedly. The combined firepower finally took effect. The creature convulsed, its limbs contracting and expanding in disturbing ways. Then, with a movement too swift to track clearly, it retreated to the tree opening and slipped inside, disappearing into the darkness below. Gallagher immediately organized a team to treat the injured deputy while ordering the rest to maintain vigilance on the opening. The wounded man's leg was badly lacerated, the edges of the wounds already showing the same grayish discoloration I'd noted on Derek's injuries. "Secure that wound and prepare for immediate evacuation," Gallagher commanded the medics. To the radio operator, he said, "Call in the helicopter for emergency extraction. And where the hell is that tactical team?" 20 minutes out, sir," came the reply. I approached the tree opening cautiously, staying beyond arm's reach of the bizarre, tooth-like protrusions that now lined one side. The darkness within seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and a faint, acrid odor emanated from the depths. "We can't wait for the tactical team," I told Gallagher when he joined me. "That thing is injured again. This might be our only chance to finish it and potentially rescue any survivors." He studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of recklessness or shock. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "What do you propose?" "A small team, 3 of us, heavily armed. We go in, locate any survivors, and get out. No heroics, no extended exploration. And if we encounter that thing again, we kill it," I said simply. "Empty every round we have into it if necessary." Gallagher considered this, then made his decision. "I'll take 2 volunteers besides myself. You stay here, Carlisle. Coordinate with the tactical team when they arrive." I started to protest, but he cut me off. "That's an order. You're still technically a patient who left against medical advice. I can't authorize you to participate in this operation." Reluctantly, I nodded, knowing he was right from a procedural standpoint. 2 officers quickly volunteered, a state police sergeant named Martinez, and one of the forest rangers, Alan Wickham, whom I knew had military experience. They prepared quickly, loading up with extra ammunition and powerful flashlights. Gallagher addressed the remaining team. "If we're not back or in radio contact within 30 minutes, you wait for the tactical team. No one else goes in. Is that clear?" Everyone nodded grimly. With final checks of their equipment, Gallagher and his 2 volunteers approached the opening in the tree. The tooth-like protrusions seemed to quiver slightly as they drew near, but remained still as the 3 men cautiously entered the darkness, their flashlight beams quickly swallowed by the impossible depth within. The minutes that followed were among the most tense I've ever experienced. We maintained our perimeter, all eyes alternating between the forest around us and the unnatural opening in the tree. The radio operator tried repeatedly to contact Gallagher's team, but received only static in response. 23 minutes after they'd entered, we heard gunfire from deep below. Multiple weapons discharged in rapid succession, the sounds oddly muffled by whatever lay between us and their source. Then silence again. 28 minutes. The tactical team arrived, 6 heavily armed officers in body armor, led by a captain who quickly assessed the situation and began organizing a rescue operation for Gallagher's team. I briefed him rapidly on what we knew and what we'd seen. 30 minutes. As the tactical team prepared to enter the tree, a sound drew our attention, scrabbling from within the opening, growing louder by the second. We all trained weapons on the dark void, unsure what would emerge. A hand appeared at the edge. Human, covered in dirt and blood, but definitely human. Then Sheriff Gallagher's face came into view, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and horror. "Help us out," he gasped. "We've got wounded." The tactical team rushed forward, helping to extract first Gallagher, then Martinez, who was supporting the barely conscious form of Ranger Wickham. The ranger's left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, and deep lacerations across his chest seeped blood through hastily applied field dressings. Most shocking, however, was what came next. 2 members of the original search team, alive but in terrible condition. One had a makeshift tourniquet around his thigh. The other appeared to be in shock, his eyes vacant and his movements mechanical as the tactical team helped him clear the opening. Once everyone was out and the wounded were being treated, Gallagher pulled me aside, his voice low and urgent. We found them in some kind of chamber, about 30 feet down. There were others too, but he shook his head, unable to continue for a moment. That thing was feeding on them, storing them for later, like a goddamn larder. I felt sick, but pressed for more information. The creature? Did you kill it? We hit it with everything we had. It fell into some kind of lower chamber, deeper than our lights could penetrate. I don't know if it's dead, but it's badly wounded at minimum. He looked back at the tree opening, which now seemed to be slowly contracting, the edges drawing together like a healing wound. Get everyone away from that thing, he ordered suddenly. Right now. The urgency in his voice prompted immediate action. The tactical team helped move the wounded further from the tree as the opening continued to contract visibly now, the tooth-like protrusions meshing together. What about the others? I asked. The rest of the search team? Gallagher's expression told me everything I needed to know. There was nothing left to recover. Within minutes, the opening had sealed completely, leaving no trace that it had ever existed except for the dark fluid spattered on the surrounding ground and the traumatized survivors we'd managed to rescue. As dawn broke over the forest, casting long shadows through the ancient trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist in our world, something that had found its way in through some crack in reality and made its lair beneath our forests. And despite Gallagher's belief that we'd wounded it severely, I sensed that we hadn't seen the last of the thing that hunted in the woods around Ely, Minnesota. 3 weeks after our encounter in the Ely forest, I sat in a sterile hospital room, watching Derek Moore struggle through his physical therapy. His wounds had healed poorly, the strange contamination in the lacerations causing complications that baffled the medical staff. The grayish discoloration had spread from the wound sites, creating web-like patterns under his skin that gradually faded to his normal tone at the edges. Looking better today, I lied, trying to sound encouraging as he grimaced through another repetition of arm raises. You're a terrible liar, Jonas, he replied, but managed a weak smile. But I appreciate the effort. The physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, gave him a brief reprieve. 5-minute break, then we're doing the resistance bands. After she stepped out, Derek lowered his voice. Any updates on the investigation? I glanced toward the door to ensure we were truly alone. Not officially. The state has classified the entire incident. DNR is calling it a wildlife attack by an unidentified predator. Bennett's death is attributed to a large carnivore, possibly a bear with unusual pathology. Derek snorted. Of course they are. Can't have people thinking there's something in those woods that science can't explain. Sheriff Gallagher is fighting the classification, I continued. He wants a more thorough investigation, maybe federal involvement. But he's hitting brick walls at every turn. And the tree? The opening? I hesitated. This was the part that still gave me nightmares. Gone. Completely normal pine when the follow-up team arrived the next day. Core samples showed no evidence of hollowing or any internal structure. If we didn't have photos and multiple witnesses, they'd say we all hallucinated, Derek finished. He stared out the window for a moment, his expression troubled. The others who were injured, Martinez, Wickham, those two from the first search team, are they showing the same symptoms? I nodded grimly. Similar tissue discoloration around their wounds, delayed healing, recurring infections that don't respond to standard antibiotics. The CDC sent a team last week, but they're being very tight-lipped about their findings. Derek absently rubbed his chest where the worst of his injuries had been. I feel different, Jonas. Not just physically. It's like... He struggled to find the words. Like there's something else in my head sometimes. watching, listening. A chill ran through me. Have you told the doctors? They sent a psychiatrist. She prescribed anti-anxiety medication and suggested PTSD. His laugh was bitter. Maybe she's right. Maybe we all just went temporarily insane out there. But we both knew that wasn't true. Too many people had seen the creature. Too many had been injured or killed by it. Whatever had been living beneath that ancient pine was real. Terrifyingly, impossibly real. I put in for a transfer, I said, changing the subject. Yellowstone. Figure a change of scenery might do me good. Derek nodded. Smart move. I'm done with the Forest Service once I'm discharged. My sister has a contracting business in Arizona. Says she can use a partner. Arizona. I mused. Good call. Not a lot of dense forests there. Exactly. Brenda returned with resistance bands in various colors, ending our private conversation. I stood to leave, promising to visit again the following day. As I reached the door, Derek called after me. Jonas, be careful until you leave. It knows who we are now. His words echoed those he'd spoken as he was being airlifted from the forest clearing, and they followed me out of the hospital like a shadow. In the weeks that followed, I tied up loose ends at the ranger station, processed my transfer paperwork, and began packing my modest apartment. I avoided venturing into the forest alone, even for routine tasks, instead partnering with other rangers who hadn't been involved in the incident and therefore maintained a healthy ignorance of what lurked among the trees. Sheriff Gallagher called me occasionally, updating me on his continuing battle to get a proper investigation. His last call, 3 days before my scheduled departure for Yellowstone, was different. He asked me to meet him at a small diner on the outskirts of town, away from both the sheriff's office and the ranger station. I found him already seated in a corner booth, a cup of untouched coffee cooling before him. He looked older than when I'd last seen him, new lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Thanks for coming, Carlisle, he said as I slid into the seat across from him. Of course. What's so urgent it couldn't be discussed over the phone? He glanced around the nearly empty diner before speaking, his voice low. They're covering it up, not just classifying it, actively suppressing information. Who is they? I asked, though I had my suspicions. Started with state officials, but now there are federal types involved. Men in suits who don't identify which agency they're with. They've confiscated all the physical evidence. Blood samples, tissue samples from the victims, shell casings from the scene. Everything. I frowned. On what authority? National security, if you can believe that. His laugh was humorless. Apparently, an unidentified predator in northern Minnesota constitutes a threat to national security. The waitress approached, and we both fell silent until she'd taken my order and retreated. Once she was out of earshot, Gallagher continued. There's more. 3 days ago, a surveying team reported finding a dead deer about 5 miles northeast of where we encountered the creature. The description of the carcass. He paused, visibly uncomfortable. It matches what we saw with Bennett's body. Systematic removal of soft tissue, strange positioning of the remains. My coffee arrived, but I no longer had any appetite. You think it survived? I'm certain it did. And I think it's not the only one. He pulled out his phone, scrolled briefly, then turned it to show me a grainy image. This was captured by a wildlife monitoring camera near the Canadian border, about 80 miles from Ely. The photo showed a nighttime forest scene, illuminated by the camera's infrared flash. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just trees and underbrush. Then I noticed it. A tall, thin silhouette partially hidden behind a large trunk. The proportions were unmistakable. Too tall, too thin, limbs too long. The head was turned directly toward the camera, reflective eyes creating 2 pinpoints of light in the darkness. When was this taken? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Week ago. And there's been another disappearance, hiker on the border route trail. No body found yet, but he didn't need to finish the thought. Have you shown this to your federal friends? They confiscated the original and told me to forget I ever saw it. Good thing I kept a copy. He tucked the phone away. That's not why I asked you here, though. I need to know if you've experienced any unusual symptoms since your encounter with that thing. The question caught me off guard. Symptoms? Like what? Gallagher leaned forward, voice dropping even lower. Dreams. Vivid ones. About forests you've never seen. Moments of lost time. Unusual physical changes, however minor. A chill ran through me as I thought about Derek's web-like discolorations and his comment about feeling something else in his head. No, nothing like that. Why? He studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of deception. Two of the men who were injured in the second encounter, Martinez and one of the deputies, they've been experiencing changes. Started with the discoloration around their wounds, but it's progressed. Martinez's wife reported that he woke up speaking a language she'd never heard before. The deputy has developed unusual sensitivity to light and sound. And the others? Wickham? The search team survivors? Similar reports. Psychological changes mostly, but some physical anomalies too. The CDC team has them in isolation now, claiming it's to prevent potential contagion. But I think they're more interested in studying them than helping them. I thought of Derek alone in that hospital room, describing something watching from inside his own mind. What about Moore? My partner? Don't know. His medical records were classified above my clearance level 3 days ago. Gallagher looked genuinely troubled. That's part of why I wanted to talk to you before you left. You're the only one who had direct contact with that thing and didn't suffer physical injuries. You might be the only uncompromised witness left. The implications of his statement hung heavy between us. If he was right, then the creature, or whatever it was, had some method of influencing or altering those it had wounded. And the authorities weren't treating it as a medical issue, but as something to be contained and studied. What do you want from me? I asked finally. Be careful in Yellowstone, keep your eyes open, and if you notice anything unusual in yourself or in the forests around you, document it securely and contact me through this. He slid a small notepad across the table. Inside was written an email address that appeared to be random characters. It's secure, untraceable to me. Check it weekly for messages. I pocketed the notepad, wondering what I was getting myself into. You think this thing might be more widespread than just Minnesota? Gallagher's expression was grim. I think what we encountered is just one manifestation of something larger. Something that's been hiding in the dark corners of our wilderness for a very long time. And I think it's becoming more active. We parted ways shortly after, both of us carrying the weight of knowledge that couldn't be shared without risking ridicule at best, or unwanted attention from mysterious federal agents at worst. I finished my preparations for Yellowstone with a new sense of purpose, not just escaping the memories of Eli, but perhaps continuing the investigation from a safer distance. 3 days later, the night before my departure, I received a text from an unknown number. Moore missing from hospital. Room empty. No sign of struggle. I tried calling the hospital immediately, but was told they had no patient by that name. When I pressed, claiming to be family, the administrator insisted Derek Moore had been discharged 2 days earlier at his own request. But I knew better. Derek could barely complete basic physical therapy. There was no way he could have walked out on his own. And he would have contacted me if he'd been released. I reported his disappearance to Gallagher, who promised to investigate but warned me that his jurisdiction was being increasingly limited by state and federal interference. He advised me to proceed with my transfer as planned, to disappear into the Yellowstone system before anyone took too much interest in me. The next morning, I loaded my few possessions into my truck and left Ely, Minnesota behind. As I passed the Forest Service sign at the edge of town, I couldn't help looking toward the dense pine forest that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, something waited. Something that wore the shape of a man, but was not a man. Something that hunted with intelligence and purpose. And perhaps, I thought with growing unease, something that could change those it wounded, altering them from within until they became, what? Puppets? Vessels? Or something else entirely? I didn't have answers, only questions that grew more disturbing the longer I considered them. One thing I knew with absolute certainty. The thing that had killed Michael Bennett and taken Derek Moore was still out there. And somehow, I doubted that the forests of Yellowstone would be far enough to escape its reach. Because the last dream I'd had before leaving Ely, the dream I hadn't told Gallagher about, was of running through unfamiliar pine forests under a vast starlit sky, my body moving with unnatural speed and grace, elongated limbs carrying me effortlessly through the darkness as I tracked the scent of human prey. And in the dream, I hadn't been the hunter. I had been the thing itself. I check my rearview mirror now, watching the Minnesota forests recede behind me. The highway stretches ahead, leading west toward new mountains and forests. I tell myself I'm escaping, starting fresh, leaving the horror behind. But deep inside, in a place I try not to acknowledge, something whispers that I'm not running away from the forest. I'm simply moving to new hunting grounds.